Episode 11. An Unexpected Date. Grace always thought that her older daughter was worthless and would bring shame on her if someone acknowledged the fact that Bessy was her daughter. Since she was afraid of being seen by her sister-in-law, Grace kept her head low, like a thief, and kept paying attention to the movement in the parking lot. Bessy was looking down at her phone when she heard the voice. She raised her head, but remained indifferent. Her eyes were dark and not as bright, and the whites were slightly reddish. She said impatiently, "I have errands to run." She stuck one hand in her pocket and narrowed her eyes slightly. Grace pursed her lips and remembered what Anne had said last time. She lowered her voice and said with a cold face, "Did you get into a fight again yesterday?" In the car, Michael answered his phone. Looking up, he saw the girl standing arrogantly beside a woman who was talking to her. The woman's expression wasn't friendly, and she was glancing around furtively like a thief. He could see both of them from the side, which looked familiar. He had originally wanted to wait for the hotel to bring in the produce, but after seeing the scene, Michael thought for a while and opened the car door. He got out of the car, his eyes hazy and sinister. The man in the hotel ran over sweating with the produce. Seeing that he was waiting outside, he hurried up and carefully handed over beautifully packaged groceries. "Mr. Clark, why are you here in person?" "Well," Michael lifted his chin, his eyes still on Bessy. His voice was very low and sloppy. "Put it in." Grace looked obviously upset. "Bessy, let's go." He raised his voice slightly, just to let Bessy and Grace hear. The fingers hanging against the door dangled slightly, and his black shirt glowed coldly in the sun, contrasting with his white exposed wrist. Grace froze for a while. Such an outstanding appearance was rarely seen in Chicago. Before she could respond, Bessy had already walked over with her cell phone. The two got into the car, closed the door, and slowly drove off. Grace took a closer look and realized that it was a very ordinary black car with a Volkswagen brand, but the car's body didn't look like it. It was probably a new Volkswagen. Who was this man? Grace was shocked by this. She thought of Bessy fighting last night and gritted her teeth. She felt Bessy was only fooling around in Chicago. She hadn't asked her about the fight last night and why she wasn't in school today. She saw a navy blue sports car coming her way. Grace immediately glanced back. She knew the sports car belonged to her sister-in-law. Suddenly, she couldn't bother about Bessy anymore and even moved to the side, so as not to be seen. "What are you doing here?" Her sister-in-law looked really great. In her 30s, hair was permed and put up in a high ponytail. She wore an off-white dress which outlined her good figure. She looked flawless from head to toe. Grace was born prettier than her sister-in-law, but at first glance, she wasn't as charming. "It's nothing." Grace was relieved to see that she hadn't noticed Bessy. She still didn't look too happy. If Bessy were like Anne, she wouldn't even wait to show her off. Why would she need to hide her like that? Her sister-in-law didn't ask much, but hesitantly glanced at the car with the Volkswagen brand driving off. She slightly frowned, as the license plate seemed a little familiar. Red light. "You will come here and take the dishes in the future," Michael said, placing his hands on the steering wheel and casually tapping his fingers. "Was that your relative?" "Yeah." Bessy put her hand on the window, emotionless. "It doesn't look like it." Michael thought for a moment. "The BMW she was driving is very expensive, and the Porsche behind her is also very nice." Bessy didn't say anything. She sat in the back seat and supported her chin to watch the stereo on the car. "Your car looks good too." Bessy leaned back. Her long legs were slightly bent and she was playing a game. Her black fringe brushed over her brow bone, and she raised her brow as she spoke. "Green light." Michael started the car and said lightly, "Good. It's not as expensive as that Porsche. How could it be compared?" Bessy didn't say anything. She looked up, staring at the Band & Olufsen stereo in the car. Silent. Band & Olufsen was a music company. The quality of Band & Olufsen's audio equipment was extremely fine and expensive that only the very rich would normally buy. There was no coding for this set of speakers on Michael's car, so this should be a new product developed in-house. She hadn't bought it and didn't know the specific price, but in this case, the minimum it was sold for was over $100,000. Bessy did not cook often, but when she did, she was very clean. She wasn't as good as the top chefs, but she did have her own unique taste. Samuel, who had not been expecting much, smiled while eating. Michael glanced over at Samuel. He was in a good mood as he had just finished dinner, so he said concisely, "Go wash the dishes." Samuel, who was drinking tea, was stunned. "Me?" Michael raised his eyebrows and rolled his eyes. "Or should I do it?" "Isn't this Bessy's job?" Eventually, Samuel washed the bowls instead. "Go back to the classroom." Michael glanced back from Bessy's hands that looked like those of an artist. He sleepily squinted his eyes. Bessy didn't want to go back to the classroom. It was too noisy. But she said nothing. She just nodded, took out her coat and went out. There was a closed sign at the school doctor's room outside at noon. The door was closed and the sun was bright over her head. No one was waiting outside the door. Bessy put her black peaked cap on. She was slender and her coat draped loosely around her body. She lowered her head and her hair slid across the side of her face as she walked by. Her momentum was strong. A teenager in a bright bow high jacket walked towards her. His eyebrows were defined and his temperament was cold. The girls on the street couldn't help but look over in his direction, whispering to each other. Their cheeks blushed. It was Kenneth. He passed by Bessy without even looking at her. Bessy went to her class and Kenneth went to the principal's office. "Come in." Principal White pushed the glasses on the bridge of his nose. He looked at Kenneth with affection. "Sit, Grandpa," Kenneth said respectfully. Principal White was the patriarch of the White family. Kenneth wasn't particularly clear about their affairs, but he also knew that his relatives were very intimidated by Grandpa. They have been close since Kenneth was a child. Principal White glanced up and down at Kenneth. The boy had always been a wonderful kid. The White family probably wanted him to eventually inherit their business. And he was also outstanding in Evanston. History and current standing were quite admirable. "What do you think of your classmate, Bessy?" Principal White lifted a cup of tea and pondered. Kenneth frowned at the mention of the girl and didn't answer. Principal White thought for a while and said, "That child has had a terrible life. She saved me once, and I like her very much. You are the same age, so if you think it's okay, how about I ask her grandma to set a date for you two?" Principal White looked at Kenneth. He was wearing a bright bow high jacket, but his face was bright and mature, and his legs were also long. His eyes were cold and clear, with pride between his eyebrows. His strength of character was obvious. This resulted from a lot of pondering by Principal White. In the White family, only Kenneth was an outstanding student. He wanted to find out Kenneth's thoughts first. Kenneth didn't expect his grandpa to talk to him about this. He raised his eyebrows in surprise. "Grandpa, did you say she saved you?" He had heard a lot of things about Bessy from Paul and had also seen her fight with his own eyes. She also seemed very familiar with the other high school group. He had also seen Bessy copying homework. He didn't expect Grandpa to pay so much attention to the newly transferred student. He knew that Grandpa's vision was always right, so he couldn't understand this. Even if she had saved Grandpa, he didn't have to let her enter the White family. Did she ask for it herself? Kenneth lowered his eyes without saying a word. "I encountered some trouble when I went to Fairfield to help the poor." As for the specific situation, Principal White said little. "She rescued you, so our family is indebted to her, but we can also compensate her in other ways. The Millers also have other outstanding family members." Kenneth deliberated, but his brows were still tightly knitted. Principal White glanced at Kenneth and signaled for him to continue. "Ann Miller is her sister. She's very good at chemistry. She has always been in the first top 5 positions." Kenneth saw that Principal White didn't really understand and continued explaining. "She was the new student who performed during the first year. She plays the violin exceptionally well and even looks good." Principal White remembered Anne's face now. He coughed and thought about it further. Now that he had some understanding, he slowly put down the cup in his hand and said, "So, it's her." His voice was faint. From what Kenneth was saying, Principal White knew he was evading it. It was a pity that he didn't sleep well these days. However, he didn't want to force it. Principal White pushed his glasses up the nose bridge and said, "It's okay. I didn't think it through properly. Go back to your class and think about it later." Kenneth went out and closed the door. He didn't notice his grandpa being visibly disappointed. Once he was out of the principal's room, Kenneth's heart, which had been so hung up with his grandfather's words, finally relaxed. If Grandpa insisted on it, he would have no other choice. They always say that opposites attract, and Kenneth found Bessy totally opposite, but at the same time, he was completely attracted towards Anne. Because of that, he could never imagine what his grandfather was proposing. But why would Principal White choose a girl who was considerably less inclined towards her studies for his grandson? Was there something more about Bessy that the principal knew that made him eager to make her become a part of his family? Episode 12. Mysterious Musical Note. Back in the classroom, the paper they'd written last night was being distributed. Since he wasn't there, Paul was helping him distribute the physics paper. Kenneth subconsciously looked in Bessy's direction. She was holding Mary's math book and copying her math questions. Kenneth was unimpressed. He sat back in his chair, with his eyes down and his head lowered. He didn't look at Bessy again. He just took out his paper, picked up a pen, and applied the formula he had talked to Anne about last time. Mary's paper was also distributed to her. The answer card was issued. Instead of reading her papers, she took out Bessy's papers and was immediately stunned. "Bessy, how did you copy everything incorrectly?" Everyone who copied homework often knew that it couldn't be the exact same. Especially when writing papers, they would have to change several answers. Last night, Mary knew that Bessy had changed some answers, but she didn't expect that she had successfully avoided all the correct ones. With so many multiple-choice questions, there was not one that was correct. Was her luck this bad? Bessy didn't care about her papers. She crossed her legs, put her cap on the windowsill, and held her desk mate's math book in her hand. She flipped through it casually, her eyelashes looking down. Upon hearing Mary's voice, she tilted her head and took her paper. With her chin in one hand, she dragged out her voice. "Could it be that I'm a genius?" "What?" Paul laughed out loud from behind. He laid on the table, poked Kenneth's back with a pen and laughed. "Young Mr. White, do you know I saw that Bessy got 0 when I was distributing the papers? She still thinks she did well. It's not easy to get a 0 when she's copied the whole paper." Kenneth was stunned. He couldn't get 0 even if he tried. But after thinking that the person was Bessy, Kenneth just shook his head and thought that he was crazy. He took out the papers to be used in the next class and no longer thought about Bessy. The first class in the afternoon was English. Miss Lewis walked around and saw Bessy leaning against the wall, her legs propped up, while she read her extracurricular books. She frowned. But after thinking of this person's relationship with the principal, she held herself back and said nothing. At night, in the Smith family's house. When Anne went back, she saw David and Elise Perez sitting on the sofa in the main hall. Elise was a gentle name, but she was full of aura and her eyebrows were sharp. With one stare, she could make people feel depleted. Anne called out obediently, "Aunt?" "Oh, Anne, you're so pretty today." To Anne, Elise's attitude was much kinder than Grace. Anne smiled at her. The aunt had married in Evanston and only came back a few times a year. "I'll go upstairs to sort out what my mother wants to use and take it to the hospital." Grace felt uncomfortable and simply found a reason to go upstairs. Besides reading a book in the evening, Anne also practiced the violin for half an hour. She kept company with Elise and David downstairs for a while before going up to the second floor. When she reached the second floor, Grace had sorted her things out and was walking down with a bag. She didn't bother Anne and went downstairs after a few words. When she turned around, a piece of paper fell out of her bag. The paper was a bit crumpled, and Anne picked it up and opened it. She wanted to stop Grace before she read the contents, but suddenly froze. It seemed to be some sort of note, and the handwriting was very messy. Anne read the first line of the note, and her heart started beating faster, and she put a hand on her chest. This was a violin notation. Grace took a few steps and saw that Anne seemed shocked. She clutched her purse, paused, and said slowly, "Anne, what are you doing?" Anne crumpled the paper in her hand. "It's nothing." She pushed open the door into the music room, picked up her score, and played a few notes by herself, her eyes tearing up. Even her heart felt tight. She looked with suspicion at the paper on the table. This was a sheet of music that she hadn't succeeded in playing in years. The writing on the sheet was scribbled and rubbed on, and it looked like it had been casually discarded by someone. But who did this paper belong to? Anne set the violin aside and leaned slightly on the back of her chair, looking down. She had seen Bessy's writing before. The writing wasn't neat, and the letters were a bit bigger. It couldn't be Bessy's. Besides, Bessy had said that she didn't play the violin anymore. Anne didn't know what to think. She dazed off into music. That evening, she was distracted by playing the violin. When she was done, before leaving, Anne stared at the piece of paper for a while. She folded it, took it to her room, and locked it in her drawer. Downstairs. After Anne went upstairs with Grace, Elise and David still continued talking. "I heard she acted out again. She's bringing another child into the marriage," Elise said with a light tone and took a sip of tea. David smiled gently and gracefully. He pushed the gold-rimmed glasses up the bridge of his nose and said, "That would be Bessy. The girl is quite pretty." Elise frowned. She had just returned to Chicago and knew very little of Bessy's affairs. The only thing David had told her was that she was pretty. "Don't hide it from me. I heard that she's got an attitude." Elise put the teacup back on the table. Her eyes were serious and she sneered. "She got into fights and was expelled from school, so she took a year off. Now she wants you to clean up her mess. My sister-in-law really hasn't grown in these years. She's so inadequate with her children." David was born rich, and Elise had also married into a prestigious family. Even though it was her second marriage, Elise still looked down on Grace. "Then you have misunderstood me. I really want to help." David shook his head and smiled mildly. "But the little girl has her own good fortune. She had a letter of recommendation, so she got accepted to Bright Bow High. She doesn't live at home either. She packed up her bags and left on the second day." Elise pursed her lips. Grace was still standing at the corner of the stairs, and her mood dropped when Elise said in a meaningful voice, "Her tactic is—" "Sister," David said. Elise shook her head. "I want to remind you that dogs that bite don't bark. Can't you tell your attitude towards Thomas has already softened?" The business world was despicable. David hadn't thought about it before, but now he had to admit it. Elise asked Aunt Ruth to refill her glass of water. She took a sip and said gracefully, "I acknowledge only Anne as my niece in this family." "I know you like Anne." David lit a cigarette and started smoking. The Smith family really liked Anne. The love of this family had always been conditional. Although Anne was a stepdaughter, she'd made her parents proud. When speaking of Anne, Elise's posture was slightly more relaxed. "Sometime later, I will take Anne on a trip to the capital. My husband likes the violin, and he's talked about it to Anne several times. Oh, and also, teacher Rupert Grin is looking for an apprentice. I'll bring Anne there to visit next time." David was surprised, but then smiled. "Anne is blessed to have won the old guy's favor." Around the corner, Grace paused for a while before coming downstairs. When she walked in, Elise looked very dignified, sipping tea and not saying a word. Grace went directly to the hospital to deliver her mother's things. Grandma Bertha stayed in a separate ward with a nurse. "Aunt and Uncle all wanted to come visit you. Andrea is also here in Chicago." Grandma Bertha's thoughts wandered along the way and her mood wasn't that great. She pursed her lips. "I booked a hotel. You can come by the day after tomorrow." A few days ago, when Grandma Bertha was sick, none of those relatives even asked her about it. After knowing that she was in Chicago right now, they were all calling her one by one. Grace was too impatient to deal with these relatives, but she was also afraid that they would go to the Smith family's villa to find her. If they did that, she would lose face in front of Elise again. Bessy's payday. Making 2 meals a day was very simple, and she didn't even need to wash the dishes. On her payday, the 2 meals added to less than an hour, and she got $50 per day. In the evening, she went out to eat after cooking. Bessy was eating noodles at a stall outside the booth. She was eating slowly and absent-mindedly. Several teenagers shoved and pushed to squeeze into the booth to eat. Not far away, in a Volkswagen car, Samuel said slightly, "Wait, that's what she's eating?" A plate of plain mashed potatoes with a few green vegetables in it. It was bland and tasteless. He saw that the teenagers all ordered dishes with fried meat. Samuel put his hands on the steering wheel. "Didn't I just give her money today? Is she on a diet?" Michael looked through the window at Bessy. "Get out." "Huh?" Samuel replied. "I'm hungry. Buy me meat," Michael said casually. Samuel didn't say anything. Did he feed the dogs the meal that Bessy just made him? He rubbed his nose and got out of the car to buy some meat for him. He also greeted Bessy coincidentally. Before leaving, he also carefully gave half a plate to her. The black Volkswagen slowly drove away. Inside the car, Samuel watched as Bessy pinched a piece of meat and ate it while leaning against the backrest. Her fingertips were slender and long. "She's not on a diet." Samuel was stunned again. Michael didn't speak. He just tilted his head slightly and his eyes cleared. "Let's go. Simons must be waiting for us." They arrived at the house. Samuel stopped the car and put a cigarette in his mouth. Then the phone in his pocket rang. He picked it up and saw that it was a text message. Samuel said in surprise as he watched Michael get out of the car slowly. Our order last night has been returned. Bright Bow High. Bessy supported her chin and was playing a game when several messages popped up. She swiped it away blankly and continued with her game. She stood up and took the headphones inside the table. She buttoned her cap and went to the bathroom. As soon as she went inside the last stall, she put on the headphones, turned on the voice changer, lowered her voice and said in a cold and dry voice, "Which idiot ordered 5 times the original price? Does he have too much money?" What was this order about for which Bessy was offered 5 times the original price? Will Bessy accept this deal? Although the mystery of musical notes continues. Episode 13. Make It 100 Times. Bessy was sitting on the toilet lid, holding the black headphone cord between her fingers. The stall door was closed. Someone else walked into the bathroom, and a schoolgirl opened the stall door. She was shocked. She didn't expect anyone to be inside. Under the dim light from the small window in the stall, her face looked very delicate. When Bessy saw the door open, she raised an eyebrow at the girl. I'm sorry." The girl's face was a little red. She closed the door and opened another stall. Bessy didn't seem to care. She set the price 10 times higher than the market price because she didn't want to accept any orders. Now some idiot was offering 5 times the amount. She cursed and continued talking on the phone. Even though there were other students in the bathroom, she wasn't the one to hold back. The impatience in her voice translated even through the voice changer. The person on the other side didn't dare say a word. She hung up the phone. Bessy put the phone back in her pocket, the headphones still on her head. The black headphone cord dangled from the side of her face, making her face appear paler. She calmly washed her hands and left. She joined Mary for a self-study in the evening. Paul was just a few steps away from them and would occasionally talk to the girls. Kenneth walked beside him holding his books, looking down the corridor, distant and indifferent. Kenneth is too cold. He ignores everyone except Paul and Anne. Mary gossiped with Bessy. Bessy slowly took off her earphones, but didn't reply. Later, when self-study was dismissed, there was a crowd outside the classrooms. Bessy had managed to avoid the peak period, so everyone was rushing to leave, and there weren't many people in the corridor now. Anne waited at the bottom of the stairs holding her books. Bessy and Mary passed by her. Anne quickly said to Bessy in a lowered voice so no one else could hear her, "Go to Hotel Kennedy Grand tomorrow night at 6 o'clock. Mother's relatives are coming." She didn't make any extra movements, but there was a hint of dominance in her voice. Bessy put one hand in her pocket and narrowed her eyes a bit. She didn't slow down. Anne noticed that and continued. "Aunt will be there tomorrow as well." This time, Bessy reacted. She gave Anne a look and quietly said, "Okay." The exchange took less than 3 seconds while they passed by each other. Even Mary didn't hear the conversation between the two. "Let's go," Mary heard Anne say to Kenneth with a smile. He rarely opened his mouth. "Anne is a winner in life," Mary said with enthusiasm. She whispered to Bessy, "Her family are all geniuses. Her parents and brother adore her, and every year her birthday is a big deal. And Kenneth is always by her side. That's why I told you not to mess with her." Bessy raised her eyebrows but said nothing. Behind them, Anne was speaking to Kenneth. Most girls in the school were jealous that she was so close with him. While Kenneth was talking to her, Anne glanced at Bessy. Kenneth casually asked, "Have you learned any new music recently?" Anne tilted her head and was a little taken aback, then pursed her lips and remembered the post-it note. She looked away. "Why?" "No reason, just asking." "There is a new one, but how did you know?" Anne smiled. He paused for a moment and looked at her calmly. "Next time you practice the violin, I'll come watch you." The next day, in the evening, Bessy left the medical office and went to the street by the school gate to wait for her car. Grace called at noon and said that Thomas would pick them up on his way. It was getting chilly outside in the evening. Bessy looked at the quivering tree on the opposite side of the street. She picked up her phone and checked the time. It was 10 minutes to 6. A black car approached the school gate. The car passed by her, but then at the end of the road, it turned back. A handsome-looking driver lowered his window, looked at Bessy and said, "You, Bessy, what are you doing here?" Samuel was the type that talked a lot and was flirtatious and friendly to everyone and thought that he and Bessy were close friends. Bessy was impatiently holding her phone. She pressed her finger against her lips and raised her eyebrows. She wasn't even trying to be polite, but was especially unpleasant today. She glanced in the direction of the school road and didn't say anything. If it had been someone else, Samuel would have lost his temper. But this was Bessy, who was always this proud. She was ridiculously good-looking, too, so Samuel couldn't be mad at her. He still wanted to say something, but the window at the back seat opened. Michael leaned halfway on the car door and glanced over. Looking quite elegant, he chuckled.
"Where are you going?"
"Kennedy Grand."
"Oh."
Michael nodded.
"It's on the way. We'll drop you off."
Bessy lowered her head. She picked up her school uniform jacket and got into the car. Michael moved aside, his long eyelashes looking down. The car was clean and didn't have any air fresheners. He didn't like them. But at that moment, he noticed a light, sweet smell. Michael leaned calmly against the door. Hotel Kennedy Grand wasn't far from the school and would take about a 20-minute drive. Samuel's phone rang. He couldn't find the Bluetooth headset, so he threw the phone behind.
"Mr. Clark, take it."
Michael leaned against the door and looked at the caller ID, then his elegant fingers pressed the answer button. Bessy didn't want to eavesdrop on the conversation, but she noticed something strange about what he was saying. In a relaxed and overbearing voice, Michael said,
"If 5 times isn't enough, make it 50 times.
Bessy frowned. He hung up. The car stopped. Bessy thanked them and got off. Samuel was about to drive off when the phone rang again.
"If 50 times isn't enough, make it 100 times.
Samuel said,
"Mr. Clark, that's not my cell phone."
Michael tilted his head. On the seat beside him was a white mobile phone that didn't belong to them. It had a caller ID on it, which was a hidden number. Michael looked down and paused a little. He had also been contacting some hidden numbers recently. Bessy realized that her mobile phone had fallen out. She turned around and walked back, leaned slightly, bent her fingers and knocked casually on the window. Michael raised his eyebrows, reached out and lowered the window. She said half-heartedly and indifferently, "I dropped my phone." Michael handed it to her. His voice was dull.
"I know, it's ringing."
Bessy took the phone, her expression still the same, and said casually, "It's just spam." Ever since someone developed software to hide caller IDs, there have been many hidden numbers now. Bessy was entering the hotel when she sent a message to Grace. A hidden number called again. She walked to the end of the corridor without changing the look on her face, took out the earphones in her pocket, turned on the microphone and connected the phone.
"The client raised the offer 50 times.
The voice was obviously processed, and there was a slight static.
"Do you want to come out of hiding?"
She leaned against the wall and didn't reply for a few moments. After a long pause, Bessy said,
"Who's the idiot?"
"Huh?" The person on the other end of the phone was shocked. "I asked, what fool is trying to place an order? Give me his details." Bessy smirked and coiled the earphone cable around her fingertips. Hearing Bessy's relaxed attitude, the person on the other end of the phone happily hung up. Shortly after, Bessy received the client's details. She changed her posture, leaned back against the wall and casually looked at the data. As she read through the messages, her veins started popping out again. She texted back one word. "Okay." Grace had been standing downstairs for a while, waiting for Thomas, who was about to arrive. In the evening, the family's driver had picked her up and didn't have time to go pick up Anne. Since Thomas was passing by, he was supposed to stop by to get Anne and Bessy. Grace was somewhat flattered. Thomas had always been cold to her, but whenever Anne was involved, he was much easier to get along with. She was now waiting for them to arrive. "Thomas, I'm sorry if we troubled you." Grace smiled slightly. She looked calm and elegant. Thomas got out of the car, looking very handsome and gentle. He replied, "It's nothing." He was very busy lately, and even at home, he was always on the phone. Thomas looked very worried, as if something had happened. So Grace and David didn't bother him with questions. Now that he was here, he still didn't talk much. He was very polite and greeted Grace the moment he got out of the car. Anne got out too, but no one else did, and Thomas was about to drive away. She glanced at the back seat.
"Thomas, where's Bessy? Didn't she come with you?"
He already had his hands on the key. He paused for a long moment, then raised his head and said in a surprised voice,
"Sorry, I was too busy and forgot about her. Do you know her phone number? I'll go pick her up."
It turned out he simply forgot about her. Grace nodded, her fingers moved, but her tone was mild and gentle. "It's all right. I'll let her take a taxi herself. You've been so busy recently, you don't need to pick her up." Thomas wasn't that much of a gentleman. Before leaving, he said,
"Give me her phone number later, and I'll apologize to her."
Was Michael the person who was placing the order for Bessy, or was the conversation she overheard just a coincidence? Another question is, was that hidden number that popped up on Bessy's phone familiar to Michael? Did Michael have any idea who Bessy Miller really was? Episode 14. I Am Not Crazy. After Thomas left, Grace pulled out her cell phone to call Bessy. She didn't pick up. "Mom, I'm sorry, I didn't think of it," Anne said apologetically, then walked into the venue and handed her violin to Aunt Ruth. Grace hung up the phone a bit impatiently since Bessy didn't answer.
"It's okay, it's not your fault."
She called twice, but Bessy still didn't answer. At first she was angry, but when she thought about it, she felt a little uncomfortable. If it had been Anne, Thomas would have definitely gone back to pick her up. Even if she didn't have time, Grace would have gone to pick her up herself and wouldn't have just glossed over it. It was because this was Bessy, not Anne. She hadn't gotten along with Bessy for 12 years now, and they'd drifted apart, especially since Bessy had a stiff temper and was so cold and arrogant. She was so difficult and didn't try to be nice and sweet like Anne did. So many relatives had come to Chicago just to see how well Grace was doing. They weren't actually there to see Grandma Bertha, they just wanted to better their relationships with Grace. She knew what the relatives were thinking. She looked down on them, but didn't want to disgrace herself either. On this occasion, Bessy could be absent, but Anne couldn't. Anne was the reason for her proud existence. As for Bessy, there were no secrets between this group of relatives. If they asked about why Bessy was still in her senior year, Grace sighed. She shoved her phone back into her pocket and took Anne up the stairs. After a while, the group of relatives was almost all gathered there. Grandma Bertha watched Grace get surrounded by everyone. She then asked, "Where's Bessy? Why isn't she here?" Grace didn't answer right away. Out of the corner of her eyes, she happened to see a thin figure coming in. The person was loosely dressed in a bright bow-high jacket and a white t-shirt. The private booth was dark and noisy. Everyone was lively, and she was the only one frowning.
"Isn't she here?"
Grace said. Grandma Bertha saw her too. Bessy was turning heads wherever she went. Her raised eyebrows were sharp and straight, and everyone noticed her presence when she entered the booth. "Grandma, where's Aunt?" Bessy took Grandma Bertha's hand. She looked around the booth and finally saw her Aunt Andrea standing at a corner, shy and quiet.
"Niece, I haven't seen you in years. You're getting younger and younger."
A middle-aged woman was affectionately holding Grace's hand.
"Oh, this must be Anne. She's so pretty. I heard that she played violin on TV. You must be proud."
Bessy heard Grace's reserved and joyful voice.
"Come, Anne, this is my brother's wife. She hasn't needed me to worry about her since she was very young. Now she's a bright bow-high top class."
Bessy had never seen these relatives before and didn't know them, but she did know that these people came here for Grace and Anne. So she didn't want or care to interact with them. She excused herself to Grandma Bertha. She went to find Andrea. Andrea stood in a corner, pinching at her clothes helplessly. Her dress was clean but obviously old. "Bessy!" Her eyes lit up as soon as she saw the girl, and her voice raised slightly. Bessy paused for a while. "Aunt, why are you sitting down?" "There are no chairs. I can just stand." Andrea laughed, then stared at the equally calm girl beside her. "Susan, this is your cousin Bessy." Before Bessy could say anything, Bessy started to actively look around. She looked cold and annoyed. There was a stool not far away with a violin placed on it. Bessy scoffed, and with an angry expression on her face, and fingers squeezed into fists, walked over. Before she touched the violin, a sharp voice exploded beside her.
"This violin is worth $95,000, Miss Anne. Don't you touch it."
It was Aunt Ruth. She had been standing behind Anne and just raised her eyebrows to look at Bessy. She walked a few steps towards her, her voice so sharp that everyone looked over. Andrea knew Bessy wanted to get her a chair, but Aunt Ruth's gaze was strange. It seemed hateful, making her feel extremely uncomfortable. Andrea pursed her lips and tried to ignore her. The booth turned completely silent. Everyone was staring at Bessy. No one found Aunt Ruth's yelling unreasonable.
"My goodness, $95,000! You can make a down payment for a house in Chicago with that money. It can probably buy 2 houses in our town, right?"
Andrea clenched her hands tightly. She took a few steps forward and whispered, "Bessy, I'm fine." Bessy looked up, laughed, and scoffed sarcastically. $95,000? That's too much money. She looked sideways at Aunt Ruth, Grace, and Anne.
The light in the booth was dim, and it hit Bessy's face, making her eyes seem even redder. She slightly narrowed her eyes, looking arrogant and proud, with an evil, sarcastic smile. "Bessy, you—" Grace opened her mouth. "What?" Bessy paused before slowly reaching out to take the violin. She weighed it in her hands before casually putting it on a table. She turned, a little irritable and astringent, and kicked the chair to Andrea. "Aunt, you can sit here," she said. The whole booth was weirdly very quiet, and everyone's eyes were on them. Andrea felt very tense and uncomfortable. "That violin," Aunt Ruth exclaimed. "That's Anne's violin." "Who cares about the violin? She's here to eat. Why did she bring a violin?" Bessy smiled. "You're so annoying. I'll pay for 100 violins if this one breaks." Bessy thought she was being mistreated, specifically by Grace and the nanny. Always so tense on their high horses, watching her every move. Were they not tired? No one in the booth said a word. Bessy raised her nose, her eyes narrowed. Then she saw a waiter passing by the door, leaned on the table, raised her chin and snapped her fingers at him. "Come." After dinner, Bessy took Andrea and Grandma Bertha and left, while Grace was still dealing with the relatives. They had come for Grace anyway, not to see Grandma Bertha. In the booth, after Bessy left, the atmosphere became lively again. Anne smiled, raised her glass, and was quite elegant. "I apologize for my sister." This part of the family was all on the richer side. They also knew about Grace not wanting Bessy years back. "That's just how your sister is." Her aunt immediately waved her hand in disregard and pursed her lips. "At 16, she hit someone in the head. I heard that he was sent to the emergency room and the police were called. Fighting wasn't rare for Bessy, and she was good at it. But last time, she got injured and toned it down. She was still fierce and vicious, which is why this part of the family was a little afraid of her. When Grace heard this, her face changed. She didn't know about the police. "Dear niece, this Aunt Ruth." The aunt saw her face and immediately changed the topic, smiling charmingly. "This is Aunt Ruth. She's in charge of the Smith family's daily life." Grace took a piece of tissue and wiped the corners of her mouth. The expressions of the relatives watching Grace and Anne changed. "What a wealthy family. They even have staff." Anne went out to the bathroom, and Aunt Ruth immediately followed her. Her tone was mocking as she said, "Miss, don't show your violin to Miss Bessy in the future. When she eventually breaks it, you'll be upset. She said she would buy you 100 more. Can she even afford one?" Anne bowed her head and washed her hands. She smiled when she heard this. "Mom, Aunt, and Anne are still—" Susan glanced back at the box, hesitant to leave. Andrea shook her head. Anne and Grace obviously didn't want to have a relationship with them, but the child still didn't understand. "Don't think about it, let's go home." She walked slowly, her footsteps sluggish. Bessy followed behind them, with her hands folded. They first took Grandma Bertha to the hospital and kept her company for a while. Susan kept looking at the facilities of the ward. After leaving the hospital room, Bessy looked back. "Bessy, tonight—" Andrea opened her mouth. "What was wrong with me tonight? Is she a fool?" Under the lamp, the girl's gaze was fierce and cold. She scoffed. "Does she even know that you injured your leg after you dropped out of school to earn money for her school fees?" Andrea was silent. Bessy softened her voice. "Aunt, I'm sorry. I am not angry at you." "I am not angry. I know you're doing it for me, but Bessy, your mother isn't wrong. Your uncle's hospitalization matters. We are all handled by her. Bessy, your mother doesn't owe me." Andrea smiled. She reached out and touched Bessy's head, her eyes softening. "Also, I don't want you to have a bad relationship with your mother. She's your mom after all." Bessy looked indifferent. Her mother now wanted so badly to sever ties with this group of relatives, and she didn't even want her daughter anymore. She was afraid that the relatives would go to the Smiths' house and embarrass her. She didn't want to tell Aunt about this. "Susan and Pete are coming to Bright Bow High, right?" Bessy took a stack of money, $2,000 out of her pocket, and handed it to Andrea. "Take this. When Susan and Pete go to high school, they need to concentrate on learning. Don't let Pete work. This is the money I earned myself, not from my mother." "I don't want the money. You keep it, or I'll buy you some clothes." Andrea glanced over Bessy's outfit. Bessy shook her head. Her aunt would easily do that. She had transferred $100,000 to her aunt's bank account back then. Now, there was almost $110,000. Not a dime had been spent. Aunt must be keeping it to use as her trust fund. Bessy said nothing and put the money back in her pocket. 2 days later, on the holidays, she would go to her aunt's rental house and take a look. She could use the money to install an AC, which Andrea definitely wouldn't do herself. Right, Aunt. Are you out of those pills? Bessy remembered another thing. She felt around in her pants pocket. Then she took out the white pill bottle that Daniel gave her and passed it to Andrea. At this point, Grace hurried over. The family driver probably sent Anne back, since it was Thomas who accompanied Grace here. Is Mom asleep? What are you two talking about? Grace asked, catching her breath. Susan rushed to answer. Auntie, Grandma is asleep. Cousin is giving my mom some pills. Grace frowned. Everything that had happened at night had made her lose her face. In front of her stepson, she deliberately put up with Bessy's temper. But Bessy frowned, tilted her head and scoffed. She was disdainful, mocking, and arrogant. Grace seemed triggered, like a balloon that got pierced and exploded. She raised her voice. Bessy, are you doing drugs every day like your grandfather did? He killed himself, didn't he? I don't care if you crazy people want to harm yourself, but now you're doing this to your aunt? Susan and Thomas had never heard of this. They were shocked. The medicine is still in the experimental stage. Bessy looked up and said slowly, I am not crazy. Grace just stared at Bessy, not knowing what to say. Who can ever imagine that a mother can be so partial with her daughter that she wishes to degrade Bessy's reputation by calling her a drug addict? Will Grace ever pay for this behavior? Episode 15. Grace's Unpredictable Experience. Everyone was shocked with what Grace said. Andrea came closer to her. Sister, what are you talking about? She anxiously pulled Grace's sleeve. Bessy. Grace spoke without thinking and was now regretting it. Don't call me that. Bessy was tall and slender. She was slightly taller than Grace, so she lowered her head slightly, her eyes cold. We're not that close. Grace found her voice. She pinched her fingers and her joints protruded out. I made mistakes too, but I only did it for you. Don't follow your grandfather's footsteps. You're still in high school. Who will take care of you if not me? I don't need your control. Bessy turned away. She narrowed her bloodshot eyes and raised her eyebrows, then reached out to pat Grace's shoulder. Other than my grandma, nobody can tell me what to do. So whether I live or die, whatever school I go to college or not, is none of your business, okay? She smiled. She said all that slowly, then turned and looked at Andrea and Susan. The two immediately followed her. Andrea was so anxious that she forgot to even say goodbye to Grace. Grace's delicate face turned very pale. Even her fingertips were shaking. Thomas stood next to her and glanced in Bessy's direction. Just like the first time he saw her, his eyes were dark and cold. He had finished his business and had come to pick up Grace as well as apologize to Bessy. Anne had urged him to rush, and he was also busy, so he'd forgotten about Bessy. Aunt Grace, you still have to see Grandma Wilson. I have matters to attend to, so I won't go up. Thomas smiled and paused. Your family affairs shouldn't be my concern, but it's not good to criticize your own daughter like that, is it? Without waiting for Grace's answer, he nodded slightly towards her and turned away, opened the car door and got in. When he put his hands on the steering wheel, he slightly narrowed his eyes. He didn't forget what Bessy had just said. The medicine that was still being tested. What did that mean? At first glance, it seemed to be a drug that hadn't yet been used, so the quality was limited. Not many people had access to it then. He did a background check on Grace 12 years ago when she married his father, and there were no particular issues that caught his attention, so he didn't care much about the marriage. While he was thinking about it, he saw Bessy and Andrea at the bus stop. Thomas stopped and lowered the window. His face showed indifference and loftiness, but his tone was gentle. Where are you guys going? I can drive you there as an apology. He drove a black Maybach. His left hand rested on the steering wheel, and his slightly exposed wrist showed a Bulgari watch. He looked like $1 million. Susan couldn't see the brand, but she could tell it was very expensive. She'd never been in such a luxurious car. She glanced at Bessy. There's no need. Bessy was paying more attention to her phone. She sat on the bench at the bus stop with her legs casually propped up. She didn't even bother to look at him. Thomas was already used to Bessy's indifference and lack of regard. Okay, ladies, be careful then, and send me a text when you get to school, he said politely. Bessy didn't answer. She just ignored him and continued to play her video game. Be safe. Thomas looked at the big boss with her legs propped up and laughed to himself. He paused for a moment before driving off. When he was gone, Susan asked, very curious, Cousin, is that your friend? He's from the Smith family, Bessy replied calmly, not pausing her game. The Smiths? The super rich Smiths that Grace married into? Susan thought, is that David Smith's son? When bus number 12 arrived, Susan said, Cousin, your school bus is here. You and Mom can take it. Wait for number 632. We'll send you off first, Bessy said casually. Grace stood at the entrance of the hospital. It was the night, and there weren't that many people coming in and out. But she still felt embarrassed. After being shut down by Bessy and then being lectured by her stepson, she felt like everyone was staring at her. She bit her lip and lowered her head and walked into the hospital. Because she walked fast, she didn't notice that when she went up to the elevator, nobody was there. It was only 9 o'clock. Although there were few people in the hospital at night, this floor was full of patients. Patients' family members, doctors, and nurses. When she got off the elevator, Grace felt like something was very wrong. It shouldn't be so quiet. There was almost no sound. There seemed to be something ahead, so Grace looked up. The first thing she saw was a man holding a mobile phone and looking at her with a smile on his face. Then she saw a man dressed in all black. He was leaning against the wall, one hand in his pocket and the other playing with a thin scalpel. His fingers were white and clear under the light. The scalpel turned slowly in his hand. His face was lowered, but she could still see that he was handsome. Even though it was all very strange, Grace was still stunned by him. She knew something was wrong. She took a step back. She reached out, took the phone from her purse and said cautiously, "Who are you? What are you doing here?" Before she could do anything else, Samuel pulled her phone away and patted Grace's face. He tilted his head and smiled indifferently and relentlessly. "Mr. Clark, she's asking us a question." A few feet away, the guy playing with the scalpel slowly stopped. Grace didn't dare move and her heart suddenly felt very heavy. The veins on her clenched fingers were popping out. This was the best hospital in Chicago, so they shouldn't be here at this time. Not to mention that this was a VIP ward, with 24-hour security monitoring. To be able to clear the area at this time of day and have the hospital administration cooperate as well? Grace didn't know how she could have offended such an important person. When she married into the Smith family, she had always been cautious and afraid of making mistakes. She started panicking. Michael looked up. He was handsome. His eyes narrowed. She didn't think she'd ever seen him before. Grace's fingers trembled violently, and the man hadn't even done anything yet. Just one glance made it hard for her to breathe. Michael paused for a while, then handed the scalpel to Samuel and took out a cigarette from his pocket. He looked at Grace again and smiled. His voice was light, slow, and with a certain ruthlessness. "Who did you call crazy earlier?" Samuel took the scalpel and weighed it in his hand. He laughed. Grace came back to her senses. Wasn't this Bessy's friend? She knew that Bessy's friends were mostly shady. But these were quite scary. She muttered, seemingly not so afraid anymore. But she was still tense because of the scalpel dangling in front of her. "Remember to apologize to her." Michael looked down. Suddenly, the elevator's door opened. Grace's eyes sparked and she turned back sharply. She watched as the elevator door opened. The dean and director from the school were standing inside. "Dean Jones, you're here!" She turned around in a hurry as if she had found her savior. But what she didn't expect was that the dean didn't even look at her. He just looked at Michael and said politely, "Mr. Clark, are you ready? Everyone's waiting." Grace turned pale. Michael shook his head. Then his phone rang, but he didn't look at it. He looked at Grace and repeated, "Remember my words." His tone was ice cold. Grace didn't dare say anything now and just nodded. "Okay." Michael retracted his gaze and even the smile on his face faded. He thought of Grace's high-end custom-made clothes. Although the purse she was holding was not a limited edition, it costs tens of thousands. Not to mention the diamond bracelet on her wrist. It was probably over $1 million worth. He then thought of Bessy's clothes again. They were clean, but looked old. Michael couldn't believe that the woman in front of him was really Bessy's mother. "If I hear you say those 3 words to her again, do you understand the consequences?" Michael lit a cigarette and smiled at her. Usually he was very easygoing, but once he was serious, his beautiful eyes were piercing and vicious. The entire corridor was filled with Mr. Clark's aura, and even the dean didn't dare interrupt. Grace didn't know who Michael was, but she also knew that he wasn't one to mess with. At this time, she couldn't even speak, so she just nodded. Samuel retracted the knife, moved sideways, and raised his chin towards her. "Get out." Grace didn't even dare to look back. She panted and trotted directly to Grandma Bertha's ward. Her footsteps were unsteady, as if she was fleeing. Samuel scoffed. "Look at how scared she is of you." Michael glanced at him and raised his eyebrows. He was calm and composed as he asked, "Did I scare her?" Samuel said nothing. "Mr. Clark, the meeting room." The dean looked at Michael. He didn't ask what was going on. Mr. Clark wasn't interested, however, and said casually, "Let Samuel explain the specific arrangements to you. I'll go back." Today was Michael's monthly surgery. The other person was a rich man. After hearing that Michael wasn't in Evanston, he quickly arranged a hospital in Chicago. Michael had come to discuss the surgery arrangements and plans, but didn't expect to run into Bessy here. Samuel was pondering about Grace, and when he heard that, he pointed to his chest in disbelief. "You want me to talk?" Michael flanked his side and bit a cigarette. He smirked. "What about it?" "I see." Samuel was a little hesitant. Michael didn't say anything else. He pressed the elevator button and went straight to the underground garage. He still drove the black Volkswagen. Isn't it strange that Michael and Samuel were threatening Grace for her behavior with Bessy, an intern? Why would someone go to this extent if there was nothing special between them? What was the reason behind this? Protecting an employee? Helping out a friend? Attraction? Or a mysterious mission behind that red dot and the phone? Episode 16. A Defeat Without Traces. Passing by the bus stop, Michael saw the girl sitting there, playing a game on her phone. Her legs were propped up and she looked like a hooligan. She was likely waiting for the bus. He stopped the car and asked, "Where are you going?" He sounded dull and apathetic. Susan looked up first. The window lowered and she looked over. She saw a good-looking man, and it took her aback. She just stood there, staring. Bessy heard him too. She finally looked up from her phone. Since the bus wasn't here yet, she thought about it, then asked for Andrea's address first before repeating it to Michael. "Get in." He laid his finger on the steering wheel. "This is..." Andrea was a little hesitant and didn't know what to say. "Get in the car." Bessy didn't know how long it would take for the bus to come. Susan watched Bessy take the front seat. She even handed them 2 mints before asking. She knew this was Bessy's friend. She sat a little slumped against the window of the car. She knew this car was a Volkswagen. Andrea lived in an old alley. There were no lights, so it was very dark. The car couldn't even go in. Bessy got out of the car to help them. Michael parked the car in the alley. "Cousin, was that your friend just now?" Susan couldn't help asking. "I guess so. I work for him." Bessy put her hand in her pocket. She didn't say anything else. Susan finally said, "Cousin, I'm going to Bright Bow High with Pete in a few days." Bessy nodded. Susan was 3 years younger than her. Pete and her were fraternal twins, and they both had very good grades. They were both going to Bright Bow High this year. The high schools in Fairfield aren't that good. Otherwise, Andrea wouldn't have taken them to Chicago. Bright Bow High's freshman building had just been completed, so this year's students would start school later than before. They would start on September 15th, and it was still several days till then. "How is Bright Bow High?" Susan looked at Bessy and asked with anticipation. "Anne is also in that school, right? I heard Mum say that she's in the top 5 and plans to go to Howard's University." Although Susan had excellent grades in Fairfield, she had never thought about entering Howard's University. It was more likely for Pete. "All schools are the same." Bessy waved her hand and said vaguely, "You'll see when you go. And I'm heading back. Be safe." Andrea didn't let Bessy enter the house either. They'd only arrived today, and their things were still messy. If Bessy came in, she would surely stay behind to help them clean up. When Bessy left, Susan looked back at the direction the car was leaving and couldn't help but say, "Mom, how does my cousin know so many friends? It seems that they are all rich." To her, having a car meant you were rich. Dad was in a vegetative state and there was a lot of daily care fees. Her mother was working to make ends meet. Not just a car. It was difficult for them to even buy clothes. Susan and Bessy hadn't seen each other for more than a year, but she remembered that from an early age, only Bessy and her grandmother would buy her and her brother candies. They didn't look down on them like the rest of the family did. "Your cousin's friends are all handsome," Andrea said. Susan didn't ask any more. Thinking about finally coming to Chicago and going to Bright Bow High, she was excited. Mom, my clothes have gotten too old. Can we buy new clothes before school? Andrea paused, then smiled. Okay, I'll take you shopping tomorrow. Pete heard them arrive and opened the door to let them in. The Wilson family had good genes. Andrea's children were both good-looking. Pete was especially handsome. Except he didn't look very approachable. No, you can go shopping without me. My clothes are fine. Andrea looked at his exposed ankle and frowned. Pete. That's it, I'm going to study. Pete went back to his room and closed the door. Andrea looked around. All the things in the house had been packed by Pete. Mom, why didn't you accept Aunt Grace's money today? Susan went to see her mom with Andrea. Andrea shook her head. Your aunt is rich, but she's not obligated to help share our burdens. Besides, when your dad had a car accident, he would have passed away if it weren't for your aunt. How can I ask her for money? Susan, remember, Aunt has money, but it belongs to the Smith family. It is not easy being a stepmother, so you must refuse anything she gives you, okay? Susan pursed her lips. Okay. Andrea sighed. She tidied the remaining stuff. Susan helped her organize the things and was anxious to start school soon. I heard that Brightbow High's most popular girl is Anne. She plays the violin so well. The school's most popular boy, I think he's called White, and he knows Anne too. One of her classmates' older sister was in Brightbow High. During the summer vacation, she had heard her classmates talking and had even seen pictures of the school, so she knew how beautiful it was. Bessy walked back. She realized that Michael had been following them from behind. When she came back, he turned away and sniffed his cigarette. Bessy opened the door of the back seat. Michael glanced at her out of the corner of his eye, then looked away and turned the key. He didn't drive back to school first, but instead went to the hospital to pick up Samuel. Samuel first laid on the back of the front passenger seat and watched Bessy play her game for a while. Then he scratched his head. So, Bessy, why are you short of money? Bessy didn't want to answer that. She looked at him and raised her eyebrows. Samuel got embarrassed for a second. You don't have to answer me if you don't want to. He turned away. He took out his phone and was about to play the same game Bessy played. He just opened the game when he saw a new message. His eyes widened and he raised his voice. This bitch, Mr. Clark, that man, that big shot, he took our order. Screech! The car suddenly stopped. Bessy was playing a game and the sudden stop made her finger slip, causing the character in her game to almost die. She looked up, indifferent. Samuel didn't think there was anything wrong with Michael's reaction. Boss, why do you think he suddenly took the order? I'm a little surprised. Aren't they? Samuel wanted to say something, but he glanced at Bessy out of the corner of his eye and suddenly stopped and looked around. Oh, look at how pretty the moon is today. Ha 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 ha. Bessy continued to stare at her phone. She didn't say anything. Her expressions didn't change. And it was as if he hadn't heard anything. Samuel was relieved and glanced at Michael. Michael slightly tilted his head and the streetlights blurred his silhouette, so that it was hard to tell what his facial expression was. But by the hand that was holding onto the steering wheel, you could tell he wasn't calm. It took a few minutes for Michael to start the car again. You could see the pain of defeat on his face. On the way back to school, Samuel didn't say anything. He was so restless, looking around, constantly checking his phone, then pulling the seatbelt again. He was obviously impatient. After arriving at school, Samuel didn't say that he would send Bessy back. So, they went to their room silently, and Bessy too walked away from them, heading to her dorm. When Bessy returned, it was close to 10 o'clock, and self-study was a while later. Bessy went in and took a shower. When she had brushed her hair and came out of the shower, Mary had come back with a few books. There was also a girl behind her. The girl had short hair, black-rimmed glasses on the bridge of her nose, and her skin was very pale. The eyes behind the lenses were large, black and shiny, and her head was lowered. She was very calm, quiet, and beautiful. At first glance, she looked like a good student. Bessy glanced at her, then lowered her head and continued to wipe her hair as if she didn't care much about anything around her. She was wearing large, short-sleeved pajamas. Bessy, you're back. Mary drew 2 papers on the table and handed them to the girl. Scarlett Rogers. Scarlett seemed to be thinking of something. Hearing her name, she immediately turned around and took the paper. Thank you. Mary smiled and said that it was nothing. She took her water bottle to the laundry room and left with Scarlett. That girl is my deskmate. She's pretty, isn't she? Scarlett kept listening quietly. When she was about to go to her dorm, she paused and took out a lollipop from her pocket. Mary, can you give this to your deskmate? Mary was holding her bottle in the other hand. She took the lollipop and tilted her head. My deskmate is so cool. Would she eat this? Scarlett pursed her lips and seemed to laugh. She said, yes? At night, Mary woke up to go to the bathroom drowsily and saw a few rays of light through the gap of Bessy's bed curtain. On the bed, Bessy put down the book on the bedside, took off her backpack from the hook and poured out the contents. She took out the black phone and opened it. The page still showed the red dots in the school medical office. "Don't think about it. I've searched and didn't see any obvious traces," she said casually. Throwing the phone aside, she pulled the computer over while sitting cross-legged and casually turned it on. She started coding something. The red dot was stubbornly lit on the side of her phone. After a few minutes, the red dot disappeared and a normal home page appeared on the phone. Was this red dot the reason why Bessy landed up in the school medical office asking for a job? Was this a threat to Bessy's alter ego, widely known as Codename B? While the secret behind Michael's reaction to losing the order to some big shot definitely shows some great loss. But was it related to Bessy? Episode 17. When the Tune Remains Unplayed. The next day, in the morning, they had English, math, and physics classes. Everyone was drowsy and had headaches. After the fourth class, Kenneth took the physics paper from the office. He happened to see the English paper that Abigail Fernandez had done 2 nights ago. Abigail was from Bessy's dorm, and she was the English class representative. "Mr. Scott, I've told you that this student is a troublemaker. Look at her test paper. You can't find anyone else who scored a 0 from their papers. Do you know that your average English score is 3 points lower than the grade average?" Miss Lewis chuckled. Her scornfulness was difficult to conceal. She had already said long ago that it would be difficult to try to influence Bessy. The average English score in her class was 3 points lower than the average grade and 2 points less than the average English score in the worst class. Mr. Scott pushed down his glasses, still smiling, showing either sadness or joy. "Children of this age are rebellious, so we have to teach them the right values." "Just keep pretending." Miss Lewis handed the paper to Abigail. Kenneth knocked on the door. "I'm here for the physics paper." Seeing him, Miss Lewis took back the sternness on her face. "Kenneth White, your English is still the highest score across the school, 136 points." What they did was a series of 10 papers produced by the 10 schools themselves, which was very difficult. It was also said that students who had just entered their junior year of high school shouldn't relax. Brightbow High average score was 69. The first place scored 136, the second place 129, and the third place scored only 117 points. Kenneth said hello and picked up the new paper. Abigail walked out slowly, and Kenneth paused as she passed by. Miss Lewis especially pulled out Bessy's paper and put it on the top. The 0 she drew was a little rough and very conspicuous. He saw it at a glance. English multiple choice questions gave her 115 points, which was a very high score. She had done the answer card. Even if she stepped on it with her feet, shouldn't there be at least one correct 1 in a dozen questions? Kenneth himself had several questions that he couldn't figure out. "Could you show me her answer card?" Kenneth asked. He was polite and indifferent. "Bessy's." Abigail didn't expect Kenneth to talk to her. She blushed and said awkwardly, "Oh, okay." She handed Bessy's answer card to Kenneth. Kenneth put the physics paper on his desk, then picked up his English paper and started to look at Bessy's answer card. Paul was still waiting for Kenneth to go to dinner. He was sitting at his desk, stretching his legs into the aisle and playing with a basketball. He stretched his head and smiled suddenly. "No way. Did she score a 0 again? Quickly, Kenneth, give me her paper so I can laugh at her later." Bessy was usually cold, and since she had just been selected as the prettiest girl in the school, her reputation had spread quickly. In each class, there were many boys dangling at the window of the class, but she didn't care about anyone. In the class, she only talked to Mary and Paul. Some outsiders wanted to provoke Bessy but chose not to mess with Paul. Who didn't know that in Brightbow High, Paul was a rich kid and the newly built school wing had been donated by his family? Kenneth handed the paper to him, brows furrowed. The paper was fully written, yet it was still 0 points. Kenneth thought it wasn't right. "Come on, Anne is waiting for us." Paul pressed the paper under the book and patted the basketball again, urging him. They had agreed to listen to Anne practice the violin, which was expected to be a new song. When referring to Anne, Kenneth paused. He didn't think about Bessy anymore, and his pace sped up. When Bessy went to the school medical office, Samuel had finished sending the last patient out. Then he turned to Michael and scratched his head. "Mr. Clark, why do you think the order was accepted?" Michael wasn't sleeping today, which was a rare sight. He leaned on the sofa with a laptop on his legs. Leaning slightly on the back of the sofa, his face was relaxed and his long eyelashes were down, like a row of brushes. On the computer in front of him was a pile of tedious data, and he seemed to be thinking deeply.
No, I heard that this person hasn't taken orders in over a year.
Samuel stood up, suddenly, and wanted to continue talking.
The order. But what are we having for lunch today?
He was very stiff and changed the subject very bluntly. Michael calmly closed the laptop computer. Bessy glanced sideways, slightly squinting her eyes. She chuckled indifferently when she saw Samuel's eyes widening.
Fish.
Samuel immediately took the car key.
Oh yeah, Nicholas just asked me to get the ingredients for the evening.
When they were done with lunch, half of the lunch break was already over. Bessy washed her hands and took her jacket and left. The sun was shining. She had to put on her peaked cap as she passed the art building. The sound of the violin came out of the open window on the second floor, and it sounded familiar. Bessy paused. Her eyes were cold as she reached down and looked towards the second floor, where the art practice room was. Anne held the violin in her hand, head slightly tilted, eyebrows slightly furrowed. The violin sound was a bit gloomy, which was very different from the usual sound that Anne made. Kenneth lowered his eyes. It was obvious that his expression wasn't the same as usual. He leaned on the side of the violin and knocked his fingers unconsciously. He was surrounded by people from the student union who had come to listen to Anne practice the violin. Anne had said today that she wanted to practice a new song, so they had all come ready to record video on their phones. The violin music went on for a minute and then abruptly stopped. Kenneth's eyes were dizzy and he didn't know what to say. Seeing that there wasn't any movement, he turned his head and softened his voice when he talked to Anne. His gaze fell on the violin in Anne's hand.
Why did you stop?
Anne held the violin in her hand tightly. She smiled brightly. I haven't practiced this well. I usually secretly practice it, so it's not perfect. I'll play it for you when I practice it a few more times. Everyone in the group said that it was fine and wanted her to keep going, as she was playing very well. Kenneth stood silently and didn't speak. He was cold. No one dared to approach him except Paul and a few others. He had some knowledge of the violin and he had heard the melody before. Anne's violin melody was very cryptic.
It's okay, you can practice slowly.
He stood upright and although there was no smile on his face, his voice was still gentle.
I won't disturb you then.
Anne watched as Kenneth left. She pulled a chair and sat down. The student union basically left with Kenneth and there were only a few girls left. Why not continue? The baby-faced girl didn't hear the crypticness but could feel that the violin melody was really good this time. I thought it sounded good. Yeah, Abigail managed to mingle with Anne's group. Anne leaned on the chair and shook her head when she heard the words. She lowered her eyes. The violin sheet was short and messy. She had tidied for the whole night only to remember it vaguely. She could barely play it, but there was no emotion and she couldn't get engrossed. While others couldn't hear it, Kenneth had definitely heard it. It was very obscure, so she simply stopped. Because the tone of the whole score was very grand and had such a strong personal touch. Anne didn't know what kind of person would write such a score. She wondered. Abigail went to the window and prepared to open the curtains, but saw Bessy downstairs. Why is she here? Abigail's distasteful tone was quite unfriendly, with a stinging hostility. This new prettiest girl had a good reputation with boys, but the girls had been gossiping about her, especially because she had been kicked out of school for a year because of fighting. The baby-faced girl glanced over and saw Paul chasing Bessy, and her fingers squeezed unconsciously. Why is Paul playing with her? Well, Paul is laughing at her, Abigail gloated. You know, she got her English paper today and scored 0. Being the prettiest girl in school didn't help. Anne, you got 117. It's so much higher than her score. Anne was initially unhappy because of that violin practice. When she heard what Abigail said, she was suddenly in a good mood. She smiled a little. Okay, why are you guys comparing that? There's nothing to compare. Downstairs. Bessy wanted to continue to listen, but the music had stopped, confusing her. Coincidentally, Paul and Kenneth had come down, so she thought about it and went on to the classroom. Paul chased and mocked her. Bessy lowered her peaked cap, took the headset out of her pocket and put it on. Paul leaned closer to her, raised his voice and continued to mock her. Bessy reached out and pressed a button on the headset. She tilted her head, then showed him the middle finger. She stared at Paul. Paul said nothing. He stepped back silently. Bessy casually walked to the other school wing. In the classroom, Paul pulled out Bessy's test paper from the book and handed it to her. When he'd be leaning on the table in front of Bessy and chatting with Mary, Bessy usually ignored him. She sat down halfway against the wall, taking her extracurricular books from the table with one hand and a lollipop in her other hand. She threw the book on the table, then slowly peeled off the candy wrapper and put the candy in her mouth. She continued leaning against the wall, lazily flipping through the book, eyebrows raised deliberately.
"Aren't you childish, eating candy?"
Paul couldn't hold back. Bessy casually turned another page. Maybe she was in a good mood, so she wasn't as closed and cold as before. She said slowly, "What's it to you? Get lost." Paul sat back at his seat, laid on the table, thought about it, and poked at Kenneth, who was doing the exercises.
"Do you want to go to the mall after class?"
Kenneth was indifferent, but he was willing to do it for his friend and thought that Paul was probably hungry.
"Yeah."
The gloomy tune played by Anne was from the piece of paper she had found some time back. Those notes were written by Bessy, as she had already mastered the art of playing violin. Maybe that was the reason why Anne wasn't successful in playing those notes. People around Bessy weren't familiar with her qualities and talents. Most of the girls around her were jealous of her looks. But why was Kenneth so eager about Bessy and her grades? Was it just casual, or was he reconsidering his grandfather's wish? Episode 18. The Red Tattoo. In the evening, Bessy went to the school medical office. This time, Samuel was somewhat normal. He had a patient, so Bessy ignored him and went to the kitchen to cook today's dinner. When she came back, Samuel was taking a phone call outside. As Bessy took a paper towel from the table and wiped her hands, her eyes fell on the assortment of medicine cabinets. There were a lot more medicines than when she had first seen them, and it didn't seem like a normal store. She didn't care that there were several more medicines, and her eyes only fell on the sleeping pills. Michael was working on his computer. He saw her interest, but he didn't think much of it. He came over with the key to the medicine cabinet. He reached out to open the door of the medicine cabinet, leaned slightly to the side and picked up a bottle of pills.
"Did you finish the sleeping pills?"
He spoke very softly and casually, which made her relax. "Yeah," Bessy nodded. Michael lowered his head again and meticulously counted 10 pills, then went to get a paper bag. The medicine cabinet was right behind Samuel's desk so that he could easily reach it. Michael reached over Bessy to get the bag. Bessy only smelled a mild mint aroma. It was warm and calm, making her want to be closer. Bessy calmly took a step back. Michael was still thinking about the data he was working on and didn't realize he might have been inappropriate. They were very close. He grabbed the paper bag and turned to the side. He put the pills in the bag and didn't dare look at Bessy again, but the glaring scene replayed in his mind. She wasn't wearing a school uniform, only a white shirt. Her neckline was a little crooked, and her collarbone was faintly exposed. On that shoulder, he could see a tip of a red tattoo revealed. This red color lined her skin and made it seem even paler by contrast. He wondered who had tattooed her.
"Done."
Michael didn't look over. He handed the folded medicine bag to Bessy and couldn't help but say when he saw her happy expression,
"Don't take too many."
"Thank you." Bessy took it. Samuel, who had gone out to answer the call, came back and hurriedly said,
"Mr. Clark, is your computer ready?" "Almost."
Michael gave the computer to Samuel and wasn't very patient.
"Look at it yourself."
"Damn it, they're urging us." Samuel looked at the computer page that still had a lot of strange numbers.
"Okay, I'll go ask Mr. White. There aren't many tech-savvy people here."
He left with the computer. Bessy took her coat and was going to leave, but when she saw how anxious Samuel was, she stopped, turned back and said, "Actually." When Samuel was fiddling with the computer, Bessy looked at the screen, which was filled with a bunch of data. The computer wasn't broken. It had been hacked by someone. The hacking method was very advanced and only an expert could recognize it. Someone was hacking their computer to capture data. Obviously, Michael's computer firewall was designed by a professional, so it would take a while for someone to crack it. Finding Principal White would cost too much time, and he might not know what to do either. Samuel was in full swing, holding the computer and pacing without even eating the food she cooked. Bessy thought for a while and held her mouth. It was Michael who rolled his sleeves and sat down to eat dinner. He politely asked Bessy,
"Do you want to eat too?"
Bessy shook her head. She was anxious and absent-minded when she put on her coat and walked out. Behind her, Michael glanced at her and frowned slightly. He slowly lifted the fishbone from his hands. As soon as she left the school medical office, Bessy's cell phone rang. It was her aunt. Her voice brought a smile, and she was happy to hear her. "Bessy, your mother and sister are coming to my house for dinner tonight, so you should come too." "Okay, I'll be there at night. I might be late, so eat and don't wait for me," Bessy said, and quickly turned towards the bathroom. It might be too late for Samuel to find Principal White. He was so anxious, and the person that Principal White would find later can only be someone who studied coding. By the time he'd realized that the computer had been hacked, the information inside would have already been leaked. Bessy wasn't a nosy person, but she thought of Michael's order. She returned to the dorm and no one was inside. She took her computer, sat at the desk and put her hands on the keyboard to start it. The computer desktop was still very clean, but today the background image wasn't a filled desert, but the ocean, with no other icons. Michael's computer was linked to the school medical office's private network. Finding the IP address was easy. Half the screen of the computer was full of jumping characters, mixed with a lot of zeros and ones. The speed they were jumping at was very high. Under normal circumstances, even this high-speed computer would slowly stagnate. But her computer seemed unaffected and still moved quickly. The dorm was filled with sounds of doors opening and people talking. It was very noisy. "Scarlett, wait for me. I'll get a carton of milk." Outside the bedroom, Mary quickly trotted to the bedroom in order to not make Scarlett wait. There was someone at the bedroom door, and she was surprised when she pushed the door open. "Bessy, why are you in the bedroom?" Scarlett was behind Mary and heard the voice, so she looked in the direction of Bessy. Bessy was almost done. She cut to a game screen without changing her facial expression when they came in. Mary took out 3 packs of milk on the table, gave Bessy one, Scarlett another, and came over. "Oh, Bessy, you play this too. A lot of people in our class play this game. Last year, Paul missed class just to go to the internet cafe to enter some league. Old Scott even punished him by making him clean the toilet for a week." Old Scott was their class teacher, Mr. Scott. Bessy said, and looked intently at the screen. Her hands were moving slowly. Mary didn't really understand the game, but just looking at Bessy, she felt that the game was very simple. How was it as difficult as those people in class had described it? Scarlett stood at the side. She inserted the straw into the milk and drank in small sips. "Aren't you going to get the papers from Mr. Scott's office?" she whispered. Mary immediately thought about it and jumped up. "I almost forgot. Bessy, see you." She pulled Scarlett out and closed the bedroom door. Bessy got rid of the game page. She switched the page, took care of it, and then kept the computer to get ready to head to Andrea's place. At the same time, somewhere deep in the country, the curtains in the room were closed, and it was very dark inside. There was only fluorescent light from a computer, and there was a strange expression on a person's face. The man sitting in front of the computer was Hacker Dennis. He was chubby, slightly fat, and wore glasses. He had a deep outline, like a mixed race, and his hands moved at a fast speed. Snap! The computer suddenly turned black and the room fell into darkness. "What the hell?" The man behind had a scar on his face, and when he opened his mouth, he looked like a writhing cricket. He was tall, broad, and his evil tendencies were unmistakable. There was darkness in his eyes that made people very uncomfortable. "Someone stopped my attack." Hacker Dennis rubbed his beard, bewildered. Scarface frowned. Few people could stop his attack. "Are the Big Den hackers meddling in this?" "Big Den has its own mark. This is someone else." Hacker Dennis shook his head. Scarface was impatient. "Who is it then, if not them?" Hacker Dennis continued shaking his head. When Bessy arrived at Andrea's house, Grace and Anne had already been there for a while. They were set and they were eating. Pete saw that she was there, put down his fork, and moved a chair for her in silence. Grace waited impatiently to give her a glance. "You clearly ended class with your sister. Why are you so late?" Bessy hung her backpack on the back of the chair, greeted Andrea, and sat down. Her words were calm and concise. "I was busy." "You?" Grace tightened her hand on the fork. Anne quickly placed some vegetables on Grace's plate. "Mom, aren't these your favorites? And sister didn't mean it, right?" She turned her head to look at Bessy, smiling sweetly. "Good girl." Grace smiled. She reached for Anne's bowl and filled it with a bowl of soup. "Your aunt's soup is delicious. Try it." Grace had always spoken sweetly to Anne and didn't dare to say anything strict to her. Anne was wonderful, and Tom, Elise, and David all valued her. Thanks to Anne, Grace's position in the Smith family was consolidated. Grace lived too clearly. She knew exactly what she wanted and what was good for her. It's delicious, Anne smiled. Grace scooped soup for her again. Yes, your aunt is very good at cooking. If you want to drink it, I'll get her to stew it. She talked to Anne and ignored Bessy. Anne smiled, raised her eyebrows, and calmly looked at Bessy. The expression on Bessy's face didn't change, and she didn't say a word. She was slowly chewing a pork rib. When they were young, their neighbor once brought her lots of books. She wouldn't share with Anne, and it made her cry. When one of the adults came in, it looked like she stole Anne's stuff. The adults tried persuading Bessy to share with Anne, since she was younger. After a few more times, Grace and James both became impatient with her. Neighbors had always said that she was smarter than Anne and was a genius. But does that mean that Anne was stupid? No. Later, when she got older, she understood that the crying child always won. Andrea picked up a rib again for Bessy. Susan, who was sitting next to Andrea, finally found a chance to speak. Anne, I'm going to Brightbow High soon. I heard Mom say that you're in the top class. Then your grades must be very good. What school are you going to go to? She wants to go to Howard University. Before Anne could answer, Grace already replied. She wants to go to the same college as her brother. Howard's was the best university in the country. Almost every high school senior wanted to get in, and only a few students from Chicago were accepted every year. Susan was envious. Anne, you're amazing. Anne had no appetite. Andrea's house was small and messy, and the stuff was dirty. Except for drinking a few mouthfuls of soup, she didn't even move her fork. Anne awkwardly looked at Bessy and said with a smile on her face, Don't keep talking about me. My sister is also a senior. By the way, sister, what school do you want to go to? What will Bessy say in reply, and will the atmosphere still remain this stable after that? Will Hacker Dennis find out who stopped his attack? Episode 19. Who Countered Black Eagle? Anne's question filled the room with a strange atmosphere. Grace looked down and focused on eating. She tensed up and stayed quiet. Susan was embarrassed. She looked at Anne and then at Bessy, not knowing what to say. Pete didn't even look up. Anne finally asked, Mom, did I say something wrong? No. Grace smiled at her. Bessy sat on her stool, legs crossed, as calm as ever. She looked up and slowly said, I'm going to Evanston. Note that she said she wanted to go to Evanston, not Howard's University. But the people at the table didn't notice. They were stunned. Even Pete looked at Bessy with surprise. Anne sniggered and ate a piece of meat off a rib. She was still chewing when she said with a smile, Oh, so my sister wants to go to Howard's University too. Good luck to you. I'll wait for you there. Snap. Grace finally couldn't bear it. She threw down her fork and grabbed Bessy by the arm. Howard's University? What makes you think you'll get in? Bessy, let me tell you, next year, no matter what college you go to, you have to leave. Since there was such a big difference between the Smith and William families, in front of the Smith family, she was even more careful. That was why she couldn't rely on James and had to take Bessy to Chicago for high school. Grace couldn't endure it for a year, but if Bessy really wanted to go to Howard's University, it would mean she'd have to stay a few more years. Grace couldn't allow this to happen. Bessy casually grabbed another rib. She glanced at Grace and smiled. You don't have to worry about it. I don't need you to take care of me. Who else if not me? I've been by myself for the past 10 years. Bessy interrupted her, looked up and said indifferently, Don't take Grandma's credit all of a sudden. Do I need to remind you what you helped me out with when I came to Chicago? Grace's face turned pale. She was suddenly embarrassed. She couldn't do anything about it if her daughter wanted to go to school. Bessy didn't take any of the things she had prepared for her. She let the girl stay in the Smith family's house, but she didn't. Her daughter had changed so much over the years. Bessy was such a pain in the... Now that Grace remembered it, Bessy looked away and propped her legs rudely and casually. I'm glad you remember. Only her grandma could tell her what to do. Grace was embarrassed, but she was also angry. Anne would never shame her like that. Fine, you're the boss if you're that good, but when you can't pass the exam, don't come begging to me to arrange a college for you. I won't help you. Thank you. Bessy was very sincere. Andrea coughed. She clamped a piece of boneless fish for Bessy. Bessy, that's enough. Bessy lowered her head and plucked the fish, nodding to her. In addition to her grandmother, she also respected Andrea more than Grace. After dinner, Anne and Grace both decided to go back. Andrea's house was old and shabby. Anne, who was used to living in a mansion, felt it was really disgusting. "Auntie, Anne, I will walk you out." Susan stood up with them. Anne glanced at her and said indifferently, "Thank you." Susan was flattered. "You're welcome." Before leaving, Grace passed by Bessy. "I want to apologize to you about what happened last time I saw you. I went too far. I just don't want you to end up like your grandfather. Listen to me and I'll spend some money to help you get into a normal university." Bessy said nothing. Grace turned to catch up with Anne. "Bessy, you really disappoint me." Bessy held a mug with a strawberry print on it, which was the special teacup she used at her aunt's house. She remembered that Grace was talking about what had happened at the hospital yesterday and lowered her head to take a sip of water. She didn't expect Grace to apologize. She stood by the window and looked downstairs, a little embarrassed. After a while, she looked at the layout of the room. Still holding her cup of water, it was very small. She had an AC installation scheduled for tomorrow. Bessy went back to school before Andrea could nag her. At Bright Bow High, Samuel took the computer to Principal White's office. The principal paused for a moment and recommended someone to him.
"This is Jacob Grant. He majors in computer science at Howard's University."
Principal White introduced the two.
"He has started a company in partnership with a team and developed his own software."
"Mr. Bright." Jacob had a serious face. The hand he stretched out was slender and clean. He was handsome and quite young, but had the confidence of a successful person. Jacob knew that Principal White was trying to draw connections for him. In Howard's University, he had also pondered the situation in Evanston in the past 2 years. If he was part of the Bright family, then he really owed Principal White a big favor. Jacob brought a USB flash drive and repair tools. First, he turned on Samuel's computer.
"What do you think? Can it be repaired fast?"
Samuel asked. Jacob frowned. He checked the computer several times, but found no major problems. Then he opened the settings and entered a series of codes. A bunch of data that normal people couldn't understand came up, and he stayed on the page.
"Mr. Bright, your computer has indeed been hacked,"
Jacob said.
"They left a signature. It was probably a hacker." "Black Eagle?"
Samuel snorted.
"Is our data still there?"
"Yes." Jacob looked at the computer very surprised.
"Someone has helped you counterattack." "What?"
Samuel found it strange. He had heard of Black Eagle before, while on a certain mission. This man was a famous hacker. As long as he was paid well, he could do both good and bad things. The law enforcement had been watching him for a while now, but he hid well. There were thousands of hackers, but some were very advanced. The Black Eagle could rank at least in the top 10 in the US. So, after hearing who the attacker was, Samuel guessed that a bunch of data they were investigating was probably gone. But Jacob told him otherwise. A hacker helped them counterattack? A hacker on Black Eagle's level?
"Do you know who it is?"
Samuel looked serious. Jacob shook his head.
"The other guy left no clue."
Samuel looked up with his head full of thoughts and stood up. Michael was already outside. He was tall, his head bowed down, and his figure leaned lazily against the doorframe.
"Have you fixed it?"
Samuel said,
"Mr. Clark, you came to me just on time. The data is fine, I'll send it over now, but this has become more complicated. An anonymous genius has helped you. Do you know who it is?"
Noticing Samuel's attitude, Jacob looked at Michael. Samuel addressed him as, "Mr. Clark?" He paused. If Samuel's identity was right, this Mr. Clark was... Jacob graduated from Bright Bow High. Back in the days, Principal White had taught them math and tutored him when he was participating in math competitions. He could be considered one of Principal White's star students. He hadn't put much thought into it, and only until he started up his own firm in the city did he realize how this status really came in handy. He slowly learned more about Principal White's identity as well. There was only one family in the whole city that Principal White could address as Mr. Bright. As for this Mr. Clark, Jacob didn't know much about him. Although he was a relatively big shot in his own city, the capital was full of people from high society, and he was nowhere close to that league. Even with Principal White's name, he could only get access to general information, such as finding out who were the people he couldn't afford to offend. Jacob looked away. Michael was leaning against the doorframe and had his eyes on the computer screen. It was impossible to know what he was thinking. About a minute later, he looked up and said firmly,
"Not too sure. There hasn't been any suspicious activity yet."
Based on how well Samuel knew Michael, he'd probably gone through the entire mental list of people he knew in that 1 minute.
That's too bad.
Samuel was disappointed. He turned to the computer screen, churned out some new data, and sent it to the two men. Assuming they had unfinished business to discuss, Jacob politely excused himself. Samuel leaned back in his seat and smiled as he fiddled with his ear stud.
Hold up. We are about to leave too. Let's add each other on Facebook.
Jacob wasn't expecting these important men to be so friendly. The three of them walked downstairs together, and Michael led the way, with both hands in his pockets. The sun hadn't set completely, and it cast long shadows on the school buildings. He walked slowly and quietly, without the youthfulness of the high school students. But judging by the girls who only dared steal glances at him but not approach him, one could tell that the pride that ran deep in his veins was unmistakable. Samuel was consistently about a half step behind Michael as he spoke to Jacob. Not too far away, Mary and Scarlett were going to the dean's office together to get some scripts. Samuel knew Mary as an acquaintance. He'd seen her a few times at club activities.
Hey, Mary, where's your desk mate?
Samuel called out to her. He then caught sight of Scarlett and smiled.
Hey, do you always make friends based on looks?
Mary and Bessy had bumped into Samuel a few times. He'd even bought them lattes before. She's busy, Mary responded, tightly holding the scripts in her hands. Michael hesitated for a moment before nodding slightly towards Mary and then walked away. Jacob was walking towards the school's main gate, then saw the two men speaking to a girl. He wondered who she was. He walked over. Mary was a little uncomfortable. She quietly said, "Scarlett, let's get going."
Why did you move into the dorm to stay on campus?
A low voice stopped her mid-sentence. Mary was a bit shocked. She glanced at the smart-looking Jacob opposite her and then turned towards Scarlett. Something felt off. Scarlett was holding onto the scripts with one hand and grabbing Mary's hand with the other. Her big, beautiful eyes were glistening. "The workload for junior students is heavy. It's more convenient for me to stay on campus." Scarlett tightened her grip on the papers and answered coldly.
Scarlett.
Jacob furrowed his brows. He wanted to say more, but Scarlett pulled Mary aside and moved to leave. "I'm going to distribute the papers." Jacob stood there, hesitating, but then decided to leave. Scarlett only slowed down when she was certain that Jacob had turned around to leave too. Mary looked at her, shocked and excited. "Scarlett, you know Jacob? He used to be very popular in our school." What was Scarlett's connection to Jacob? Will Michael and Samuel ever find out who countered the Black Eagle? Episode 20. Traces of the Untraceable Bee. Mary was from the parallel stream in Bright Bow High. Back when she was there, she'd heard of Thomas and Jacob, the two big names in their school. "I heard that they are starting up a company together," Mary gossiped in whispers. "You know Anne from your class is Thomas's younger sister. Back then, both of them were friends with Anne, and the influence she had on them was unparalleled. You know that our mayor's family name is Grant, right? I would have never guessed that you know Jacob, but, well, like everyone who is friends with him is cool by definition." Scarlett shook her head. "I have distant relatives in the Grant family, but I'm not close with Jacob. I have never been to his place, and I know that they're all very cool, but I can't be compared to them." "Why can't you? You're the second top student in the whole of the school. Scarlett, don't look down on yourself like this. Before my deskmate came along, there were even debates about who was the prettiest girl in the school. But ever since Bessy joined the school, people stopped posting things like that." Scarlett suddenly smiled and looked in the distance. "My grades used to be terrible. I got a single-digit score for math once." "Don't lie to me." Mary wasn't buying it. Scarlett's math grades were only second to Kenneth's. Math wasn't like other subjects. It was based on practice and prior experience. Given her top grades now, how could she ever be bad at it? Scarlett smiled and didn't explain further. Mary knew Scarlett because of the competition. They were deskmates in the competition preparation class. She always felt that Scarlett was constantly sad inside. They'd known each other for 2 years, and Mary had never heard Scarlett mention her parents. Later, both of them parted ways at the bottom of the stairs. A few days later, Bessy rested her head on the desk between classes. Kids were being loud, and she couldn't keep her eyes closed. Eventually, she rested her chin on her palm. Mary distributed everybody's papers and finally handed the last one to Bessy. 6 points. Better than the last time. Mary consoled her. "We're welcoming new students to school today. It'll be pretty bustling." Mary saw that Bessy looked a little flushed and unhappy and asked her, "Bessy, are you okay?" She knew that Bessy was working part-time. It was pouring so heavily last night and she didn't have an umbrella. She must have been drenched on her way back from the coffee shop. "I'm fine." Bessy sounded a little down. She turned sideways and leaned against the wall instead. Mary was a little worried for her. She got another classmate to bring some flu syrup over and made sure Bessy took some. Bessy felt even more drowsy after taking the syrup, but she still couldn't sleep. The sounds of the new kids downstairs buzzed in her head. She put on her headphones and turned the volume up. Hours later, she finally made it through the whole day of school. It was crowded everywhere, except for the school doctor's office in the corner. Bessy heaved a sigh of relief. In the school doctor's office. As it was the first day of school for the new students, the doctor's office was unusually empty. It was nice and quiet. Samuel was working on his laptop, and later he went to a site with a full black background. He was chatting with someone online, and the symbols used were rather strange. An ordinary person wouldn't be able to make out what they were. He was having a casual conversation, until the other person sent him a reply that almost caused him to choke.
Mr. Clark.
Samuel widened his eyes at the screen and stammered,
"I think there's a clue."
Michael was looking through some patient's paperwork with a fountain pen in his hand. He was completely calm and hadn't even raised his head.
"Why the fluster? Shoot." "Based on Flat Face's investigation, the person who helped us goes by B." Bam!
Michael slammed his fountain pen onto the table. The person who'd just told Samuel not to get flustered had lost his cool. He quietly reached for a cigarette, but didn't light it.
"Are you sure? That seems out of character." "Flatface already got it checked. He looked into the case of the 7 undergraduates who'd lost contact 3 months ago. The traces are very similar."
Samuel found it unusual, too. With one hand resting on the keyboard, he turned around to look at Michael.
"It's unlikely for anyone else to be able to clamp down on Black Eagle. I think it must have been that bee. You really don't know who that is?"
Michael spun a lighter in his hand and looked through the glass pane as a girl walked towards the office door. Her cheeks were unusually red, and she seemed a lot less distant and unapproachable. Michael kept the cigarette between his lips and didn't say a thing. Samuel shut his laptop and stopped talking when he saw Bessy coming. Bessy knew what they'd been talking about before she came in and that they were somewhat avoiding her, but she wasn't bothered, especially with this headache now. She went to the pantry first. Michael put aside his paperwork and knocked on the laptop.
"You're sick."
Bessy slowly made her way further into the kitchen. She sounded weak. A little.
"Bessy, how did you fall sick? Come, take some rest here. I'll check your temperature."
Samuel quickly stood up and let Bessy take a seat. He went to get a thermometer for her. "It's no big deal. I took some meds in the morning. I'll go start cooking," she casually said.
"No."
Samuel shook his head.
"You're already sick. Don't put up a front. Sit down."
Michael got up and let her have the couch seat.
"Samuel, get the Kennedy Hotel to send some food here."
Samuel was taken aback to see that Michael had given up his couch seat, but he went ahead to make the call anyway.
"Don't go to the cafeteria anymore. It's too crowded."
Michael got a thermometer and handed it to her.
"Take your temperature."
Bessy didn't think a fever was anything to fuss over. It wasn't as if she broke a limb or anything. She took her temperature. 103 degrees Fahrenheit. Michael put his brows together and quickly prepared the IV bag to put her on a drip. He then got her a glass of warm water and even added some syrup, as ill people usually have very dry mouths. The couch was very comfortable to lean back in. She drank the sweetened water and felt drowsy as the sounds of Michael flipping through his paperwork faded into the background. He could hear her slow, steady breathing. Michael put his documents down and turned to look at her instead. Perhaps it was because she was sick. The headstrong vibe she usually exuded had dissipated. Her lashes were pointing downwards, and there was a pale green area beneath her eyes, emphasizing just how thin and fragile she looked. She was all curled up into a tiny ball in the corner of the couch, as she didn't want to disturb him. He looked at her for a while and felt something skip in his heart. It was rare for Bessy to sleep so soundly. By the time she woke up, the IV bag was emptied and the afternoon self-revision sessions were almost over. Meanwhile, some porridge was being heated up on the stove. Samuel gathered some medicine for another student. Seeing that she had taken some of the porridge and was eating at the table, he asked,
"Do you want me to help you apply for leave from classes?"
"No need." Bessy shook her head and smiled. She spoke casually and said, "Thank you for today." Michael furrowed his brows. He'd prefer if she stayed and rested well for the afternoon, but he didn't voice his opinion. When she'd left, he put his paperwork down and finally lit the cigarette. Michael was getting frustrated. Samuel seemed to be pondering on the mystery as he looked at him and stroked his chin. As he turned his face, his eyes narrowed, looking at something. Samuel walked to the sofa where Bessy was lying, and there he found a keychain stuffed in the corner of the sofa, which probably would have dropped from Bessy's pocket as she was lying down. Samuel grabbed the unusual-looking keychain, which looked like the alphabet B that resembled a language code. This raised curiosity about Bessy in his already occupied mind. Was this keychain the answer which Samuel and Michael were looking for? Will Bessy's keychain prove that she is not just a student, but much more than that? Will all of this really solve the biggest question of the untraceable B? Samuel carefully placed the keychain in his palm and called Michael, who didn't care to get up off his seat, and asked from there itself,
"What is it?"
Samuel told specifics of the keychain to Michael, and before he raised his suspicion on anything, Michael rejected all of it, saying he was busy and that the keychain was merely a local trend. "It is something that's going viral right now."
"Everyone wants to look cool and possesses these keychains. I've seen the same with almost 20 kids. What do you conclude with this information now?"
Samuel opened his mouth to speak, but shut it back, thinking Michael was right. Maybe he tried to logically justify the situation and put an end to his curiosity. Samuel called Bessy, who obviously didn't answer. Samuel somewhere knew Bessy won't answer calls as she was unwell, but then he couldn't stop himself from texting her. Samuel waited for Bessy's reply, and he was hoping to put her on the spot. Soon, his phone beeped and he was alerted with a notification. Seeing the reply, he could not believe his eyes. What could have been the message that caused Samuel to raise his eyebrows in utter disbelief? What was he going to do next? Episode 21. The most popular girl in the school. Samuel's message was,
"Hi Bessy, found your keychain. It says B and has some computer codes written. Do you want to tell me something?"
Bessy replied, "It's okay, I've got 20 more of those. If you like, you can buy it from a vendor outside the university." Samuel felt foolish about his own thoughts. How can he judge based on a keychain? Bessy's fever had subsided by afternoon. She was still a little weak, but was in a way better condition than in the morning. But the thought that discussion was about unearthing the mystery behind codename B kept ringing in her mind. 12 points for physics, 18 points for chemistry. Mary helped Bessy get her test results. "Bessy, you're amazing." If she rounded it off, it would be considered a pass. Bessy looked at Mary but didn't say anything. They received their English papers in the last period. Kenneth didn't leave immediately and didn't stop Paul from going over to look for Bessy either, but his eyes were on them.
"Has your fever subsided?"
Paul furrowed his brows slightly.
"Why didn't you apply for leave?"
Bessy nodded, picked up her books and sniffled. "I'm all right."
"Rest more and drink warm water."
Paul thought for a bit before returning to his seat and getting a lollipop from under his desk. He handed it to Bessy and cheekily raised his eyebrows.
"Eat this."
At this point, Anne had already arrived outside the classroom and was waiting for Kenneth and Paul. She was shocked to witness the scene in front of her. She turned away, not looking at Bessy. Yet she couldn't help but peek in the general direction. Paul always acted like a brat. He sounded playful even when talking to her. It was rare to see him speak so gently to anyone. A while later, Paul grabbed his bag and left with Kenneth through the back door. The first thing he said was,
"Mr. White, Bessy's English scores improved 30 points.
He was mocking her.
30 points? Yep, that's a huge improvement. Last time she scored 0.
Paul put his hands in his pocket. Anne saw that Kenneth still looked cold and uninterested. He smiled, but didn't say anything else. She felt relieved. The three of them were influential figures in school. Any one of their appearances could get schoolmates whispering, let alone when they appeared together. Some students would even stop at the bottom of the stairs to wait for them so they could walk together. 5th class of new students. Susan, let's go off together. Susan's deskmate was a bubbly girl with a ponytail called Zoe Peterson. She was from the other class too. Neither of them lived on campus. The easygoing Zoe casually put her arms around Susan's. With the arrival of new students today, the campus was bustling with crowds everywhere. There was some commotion further up in front of them. From a distance, they saw that a line of 3 people was the source of the commotion. There was a girl in a dress instead of the school uniform. Next to her were 2 very good-looking guys. Susan, look, that cool-looking guy over there is our nerdy popular boy. He's a junior, Kenneth. The other guy is Paul, the heir of Doug Adams. Zoe squeezed Susan's arm in excitement. And the girl next to them, do you know her? I do. She's our school's most popular girl. Susan looked towards Anne with envy. She was having some mixed feelings as she saw the fine-looking guys next to the beautiful girl. Pfft! What prettiest girl? What century is your information from? Zoe looked away from Anne. Don't you know that the most popular girl is someone else now, since the day juniors started having classes? We have a different most popular girl now? Susan heard about this only during the summer break and was stunned. Who is it now? The news of the most popular girl had taken the school by a storm. Most people were aware about it, except for Michael and Samuel. Zoe said surprised. The prefect? The female prefect? Is she a repeater? Her results should be quite good. If she could come to our school, what trouble did she have previously? Susan answered. She has poor grades because she skips class every day and fights. She's almost the last in school. Her teacher stopped trying to help. She could go to Bright Bow High School, however. Susan looked in Bessy's direction and lowered her voice. Anyway, I will not say more about the specific reasons. After she finished speaking, Zoe thought deeply. She looked anxious to gossip. Susan couldn't help but look in the direction of Michael and Samuel. Michael leaned quietly on the door. His expression was relaxed, while playing with his mobile phone. He had good-looking hands, long fingers and clean fingertips. His knuckles were raised as he pinched his phone. His eyebrows were slightly down. It was still obvious that he was looking towards Bessy. He didn't even care what she was talking about. As for Samuel, his hand was on the car window. He was chuckling. Michael, I didn't expect Bessy to be so cool, he said. The reaction of the two was beyond Susan's expectations. Susan couldn't tell what they felt, so she just pursed her lips and stood there. Bring the bag back to my aunt. I bought it last night and didn't have time to bring it back. You can help me, Susan requested. Bessy returned and gave the bag to Pete. After listening to this sentence, Pete frowned. He wanted to say something, but he'd always been quiet, so he just silently took it and turned around. Susan didn't dare to look at Bessy. She whispered, Cousin, I'm going. After Pete left her, Bessy got into the car, but the car would not start. A little girl ran out of the bubble tea shop. Because she ran fast, her face was flushed, and she handed over a cup of bubble tea. Bessy, thank you for helping me to work overtime last night, said the little girl. Bessy leaned on the back of the chair and said without much energy, It was nothing, Bessy replied. The little girl hurried back to work again. Michael was sitting in the passenger seat. He leaned on the back of his chair and looked in the rearview mirror. She was holding the bubble tea cup, and her complexion had improved a lot. However, her spirit was still weak. You work part-time at the bubble tea shop too? Michael asked. Bessy poked the straw in and nodded. Michael raised his eyes. Are you short of money? He questioned. He thought of how Grace had been decked out in famous brands. He didn't know the details of her family, but Grace didn't look like she came from a family that lacked money. Yeah, Bessy nodded, without any psychological burden. Michael didn't speak. The Smith family and Thomas decided to stay at home tonight. Anne had come back home. There was not any self-study for her. Bright Bow High School's self-study was primarily for the boarding students, so she was freer. At the dinner table, the Smith family mainly focused on 3 things. One was about Thomas's being recently busy at work. The other was when Elise would return to Evanston. Lastly was the current situation of Anne's learning. Is Jacob back? David inquired. David and Thomas were chatting casually. Thomas nodded. This time our project is in Chicago. He will come back naturally. David patted his shoulder. Do well with him. The Grant family was a real prestigious family in Chicago. His father was the mayor, and the Smith family had a normal relationship with the Grant family. Even David couldn't see the mayor easily. However, Thomas had a close relationship with Jacob. Elise also laughed. She gave Thomas a piece of vegetable. She said in a gentle voice, "The Grant family has a deep foundation. There won't be any big problems if the two of you cooperate." Thomas bowed his head. "I know." After talking about Thomas, the conversation turned to Anne again. Elise asked this question in more detail and learned that Anne had done well in her exams, so she naturally was eager to praise her. This was an ordinary test. It's useless to take 9th place. Anne smiled and spoke humbly, but the pride in her voice couldn't be hidden.
"You're just being humble."
David smiled happily. The atmosphere on the table was very good. Grace sat next to David. She gave David a piece of meat and smiled. Then she called Aunt Ruth to bring another bowl of soup. She did it all with the aura of a hostess. Elise glanced at her and put her fork down. "Anne, I heard that your older sister is also in Bright Bow High School. How is she doing?" Elise asked with a smile. Grace's face froze. Anne's expression remained unchanged. "I'm not in the same class as her, so I don't know." She paused. "But after seeing her score of 30M in English, I think my sister just came here. She might not be used to our school's learning methods. It'll be fine once she gets used to it." "Huh." Elise picked up a paper towel and wiped the corners of her mouth. In her dull voice, exclaimed, "The education in Fairfield is really bad. Anne, thank God you grew up in our Smith family." Grace's expression was even worse. After the meal, everyone left to do their own things. Anne went upstairs to practice the violin. The violin score was still in front of her. She played it several times. Although the song was good, Anne really couldn't pull off the emotions behind it. She sat on the chair for a long time and locked the score in the drawer again. Although the song was good, it was too time-consuming to practice, so she decided to take a break. She will practice again tomorrow. The study room was also on the 2nd floor.
"When are you going to return to Evanston?"
David gently asked. He poured a cup of tea for Elise. Elise pressed her temples, looking tired. She replied, "In 2 days."
"Just know when you have to leave,"
David stated. Elise picked up the teacup and took a sip. "About Mr. Rupert, I listened to the violin played by Anne yesterday. I think she basically only plays songs that everybody already knows." Elise emphasized.
"She's still young. She can't compose yet."
David laughed. "Mr. Rupert likes apprentices with their own spirits. This kind of popular music does not impress him. I'll settle down and let Anne concentrate fully on composing. There is still some time left. It's completely doable. I'll take her to Evanston for a few days. Joshua would surely like it," Elise suggested as she put down her teacup.
"Just as you've planned."
David had no opinion. For so many years, he also regarded Anne as his biological daughter. The atmosphere on both sides was good. Elise indeed played her weight at night. When Elise came back, everything basically revolved around her. Grace, who was walking into the room with her mobile phone, was uneasy. She pulled out a phone number in the phone book and pressed it directly. Samuel continued to order meals at the Kennedy Grand Hotel every evening. Bessy wanted to thank the two for their warm help from earlier, but Samuel didn't give her the opportunity. Michael only asked Bessy to sit and take good rest. Then, he took his thermometer to measure her temperature. When he saw that her fever was almost gone, he poured her a glass of water and then sat down on the sofa. Bessy took a sip. It still had a touch of sweetness. Noon hadn't been an illusion. She felt much better. She held the cup while watching Michael and Samuel. Although these two were capitalists, they were simply too good as bosses. Since they didn't let her work, Bessy wanted to make it up in other ways. She sniffed and looked at Michael. She wanted to say something when her cell phone rang. It was Grace's voice. It sounded irritable, and there seemed to be suppressing some anger. She needed to get a few things off her chest, so she took the liberty to do just that and vented. "Bessy, why aren't you learning well even in Bright Bow High School? How could you score 30 points? I can't even buy over any school with this score. Do you know that at today's dining table this is unacceptable?" yelled Grace. Bessy had very little contact with Grace. Her head had already been throbbing, and the sudden sharp voice made her veins tighten. She coughed 2 times before saying emotionlessly, "If you don't have any other damn thing to say, I'm hanging up," Bessy shouted. If possible, Grace would also like to ignore her, but she was her own daughter. Outsiders would always point at her and say that is Grace's daughter. She is in last place. She breathed a sigh of relief. "From this week on, I found a few teachers for you. You can go to tuition classes obediently. You will go once you are on vacation. I do not want you getting into trouble everywhere." said Grace. She didn't finish talking because Bessy had hung up the phone. Putting away the phone, Bessy leaned back and tilted her head. Her good-looking eyes were squinted. She looked quite arrogant. "Do you have another computer?" she asked. Michael didn't ask her what she wanted to do. He just put down his things and brought a computer over to her. When Bessy took over the computer, he asked, "Who was it? It sounded like a bitch." Bessy's cold fingertips swiped across the computer. The corners of her lips weren't smiling and revealed a bit of casual coldness. This matter wasn't complicated to explain, so Bessy told why she had come to Chicago succinctly. It was quite brief, but Michael understood the main parts. He looked at Bessy for a while and then said, "Your mom, is she your biological mother?" Michael asked. Bessy's voice did not sound like herself. She was still weak and coughing. Michael stopped looking at his documents. He kept staring at her to check on her condition. He frowned at the thought of how Grace didn't even ask about her. This sentence made Bessy smile. She was quite happy. "Yeah, she is," Michael said. Bessy's USB flash drive was with him. She stood up, looked around the room and took the computer. She took it to the floor near the window. Michael's computer had a spy screen, and this place was a dead end. Unless he stood behind her, he wouldn't be able to see what she was doing. She opened the USB flash drive and started work casually. She hadn't taken orders for more than a year. Episode 22. Attack together. Save time. Michael was preparing for his Sunday operation, but he still couldn't calm down. He looked at the words he had written down on the paper. He knew them. However, he couldn't piece together the correct meanings. He tilted his head back and looked at the girl. She was sitting on the floor. She was still wrapped in a shirt, and her face didn't look as relaxed as usual. Her expression was a little more serious than he had ever seen before. He squinted slightly and didn't know what she was doing. However, her whole body seemed to be glowing. He moved his hands. After a short while, he turned to find a cup. He poured a cup of warm water and put a few pills beside it. While he did it, Bessy's eyes didn't even deviate slightly. After work at this time, Samuel went back to the gate of the yard. He picked up the meal that Kennedy Grand Hotel had just delivered. He originally wanted to call Bessy, but was interrupted by Michael's gaze. "Then we'll eat later," Michael stated. Samuel placed the 2 wooden boxes on the table. "Michael, have you arranged for the surgery on Sunday?" he asked. He came over and looked at the notebook in Michael's hand. Damn it, it was still the same as at noon today. Nothing had changed. Samuel was curious and questioned. "Michael, why haven't you finished it?" Michael glanced at him. His good-looking fingers hit the table. He said concisely, "No time." Samuel said nothing. Bessy finished her work. It was already 10 minutes after dinner. She ate and took her medicine before looking around the school medical office. She cleaned the things that needed to be tidied. As soon as she was about to leave, her sleeves were tugged on by Michael. If it had been somewhere else or someone else, she probably would have frowned. She may have even broken their hands because she was so impatient. "What's the matter?" At this time, Bessy's mood was rather good. She turned sideways, looked at Michael and narrowed her eyes casually. "Bring this cup. This cup is new. No one has used it," Bessy commanded. Michael passed her the thermos cup that she had just drunk from. He was a little lazy and his eyes were dark. He paused for a while before saying, "You're a girl. Don't always drink cold water," Michael exclaimed. When Bessy came to the school's medical office, she always carried a bottle of mineral water or a can of cola. Michael had observed these many times. She was his patient and she was ill. He was concerned about her well-being, and he had every right. Bessy took it and glanced at it. The white cup looked pretty. Michael touched her fingertips. After the temperature dropped, her fingers became cold. He quickly retracted his hand. "Thank you," Bessy said as she waved her hand at Michael. Michael looked at her body as she left. He raised his eyebrow, in a complicated way, and stared. His eyes were pierced for a long time. "My, Michael, what are you looking at? We should go," Samuel stated. He was walking towards Michael. Michael retracted his hand, got up, and looked expressionless. "Let's go," Michael shouted. Bessy returned to her class and studied by herself. Her evening self-study was reading a book and copying papers. She put away the notes that Pete had given her and started to sort through her papers. She put the test papers one by one, from small to large according to their score. Then, she put it back in satisfaction. She began to look through a foreign book that had not been translated. I love Christian's new album, and it will be on sale tomorrow morning at 9.
Bessy yelled. Mary Smith's voice beside her was still very loud, even if it was deliberately suppressed. Fortunately, classes had already ended, so her voice wasn't abrupt. She shook Bessy's arm.
Bessy, look at him, he's so handsome,
exclaimed Mary. Bessy glanced at the screen. It was a magnified young man. He had on a black punk outfit with thick eye makeup that looked very casual. His eyebrows looked pretty. They were considered very outstanding in the entertainment industry.
Do you know who he is?
Inquired Bessy. Mary was very excited to show Bessy her idol. Wow. Bessy propped her legs up and said astonished. Bessy, are you a fan too? Mary asked. Mary quickly brightened up. Bessy, expressionless, said, no. Mary wasn't disappointed. She was very excited to share with Bessy. Mary wanted to tell Bessy her love towards the idol. In 3 years, he has become so popular all over the country. The songs he sings are all magical, Mary said. Bessy took out a lollipop, peeled it, and put it directly in her mouth. After self-study class, Bessy and Mary returned to the bedroom. Their bedroom was at the end of the corridor, so they passed by Scarlett's bedroom. Scarlett had returned early. She had cooked a bottle of boiling water. A pretty girl blocked her dormitory door. Scarlett, why did you add 20 points to your college entrance examination? Are you a minority? Questioned the pretty girl. The girl had a shawl in her hair and squinted at Scarlett. Scarlett lowered her head. She didn't say a word, nor look at her. Forget it. Layla, don't make a mess. The host is coming, stated the pretty girl. Layla put her hand aside, and she stood a bit arrogant. Why can't I talk? Asked Layla. Kenneth and Scarlett are always about 20 points apart from each other. Catherine already said that she added 20 points and has a good chance of getting champion. There weren't many small enterprises in school. Layla was naturally for Scarlett. Tell us yourself. We're all humans. Are you one class higher? Asked Layla. Several people stood in the way and blocked the side road. Several passing girls didn't care to lift their heads. They just walked past them. Bessy didn't go around them. She lowered her head. She said concisely, "Make way, it's troublesome." Her eyes were pale and reddish. She weighed the cup in her hand. Layla Johnson froze. What did you say? Bessy asked. Layla was quite a troublemaker in first middle school. Seeing this scene, the girls who wanted to get water in the corridor quickly returned to their dormitory. Unless they were passing by, no one wanted to step forward. She was Kenneth's #1 fan. Layla didn't want to provoke Anne, so she could only express her anger in other ways. Bessy looked up and smiled, but her tone wasn't very good. The evil spirits in her eyes almost rushed out. It was suppressed again, and she closed her eyes. I said, make way for good people. Don't block the way, demanded Bessy. Layla looked at the girl. She couldn't believe that someone dared to talk to her in this way. She was unfamiliar, with white skin and a good-looking face. It was very hot, but she was wearing a jacket. She even had her clothes pulled up high, like an obedient student. Mary didn't respond. She looked at Bessy and didn't say one word. Her father was an upstart and had donated a library. Her results were rather good as well, so she was in class 3.1. Which class are you from? Don't you know who I am? Layla's eyes became amused and a little disdainful. The few girls behind her surrounded her instantly and she sneered. You're looking for death, said Mary. Bessy let Mary take her cup. Mary came back to her senses. Bessy, what are you doing? Don't rush, shouted Mary. In the school, few girls dared to provoke Layla. Bessy reached out and took off her school uniform jacket. There was a white t-shirt inside. She put the school uniform jacket in Mary's hand. Her eyes appeared to be squinted. Bessy said calmly, We'll attack together and save time. Bessy rolled her sleeves and narrowed her eyes slightly as she looked at Layla, chuckling lowly. Suddenly, the goosebumps on Layla's body stood up and felt instinctively dangerous. Her pupils shrank, and she tried to take a step back, wanting to escape. However, before Layla could take a step back, her whole person was strangled by a huge force, and she was severely thrown against a wall by her neck. There was almost no strength in the body. Bessy held on to Layla with one hand, stretched her legs, and knocked the other two girls to the ground. She looked at the last girl, raised an eyebrow, and smiled. Do you want a taste of this too? Asked Bessy. Girls and boys of this age were unscrupulous in their actions, and in Bessy's eyes, they were just easy targets. Stop fighting, Bessy exclaimed. Behind her, someone pulled her sleeve. It was Scarlett. Bessy didn't speak.
She just looked down at Layla expressionlessly. Layla's eyebrows were cold and sweaty. The girl in front had her hair tied up and a few strands of hair fell to the side of her face and stopped at her mouth. Her eyes were pretty, but her pupils looked blood-stained. Her stare was scary and made people feel goosebumps. Everyone in the other bedroom knew about this change. Abigail was also a little scared, but she glanced at Layla and the others, stood by the door and said, "Bessy, don't go crazy. I'm going to find the host." Bessy opened the next door. When the door hit the wall, it bounced back fiercely with a loud noise. Not only Abigail was afraid to speak, but the entire floor was also silent. Bessy was a little taller than Layla. She let go of the hand that was against her neck, lowered her head slightly and smiled softly. After a long while, under Layla's frightening and somewhat strange eyes, she let go of her hands and slowly put down her rolled-up sleeves. She went to get her cup back from Mary. Still, with bloodshot eyes before she left, she turned slightly and smiled wickedly at Layla. "Mind your own business and eat more," Mary said. She took the cup and walked to her bedroom without any rush. The remaining girls standing in the corridor were like frightened white rabbits jumping to make way for her. Almost all the girls in the hallway shrank into the bedroom door and watched her enter the room. She was the first girl who dared to mess with Layla. For a few minutes, none of them were able to come to their senses and were extremely quiet. After Mary took a shower, she didn't see Bessy in the dormitory. She frowned and didn't see her until she came to the balcony. She saw Bessy sitting on the balcony with her back to her legs dangling slightly. Mary was so scared that her heart suddenly stopped. "Bessy!" Mary yelled. Episode 23. Who are you showing off to? Bessy had heard her noise and she squinted slightly, her eyes narrowing. "What are you panicking for?" questioned Bessy. There was still an unlit cigarette in her mouth, and she dangled her legs carelessly. The night scene soaked through her as she thought about something. Mary didn't respond. Bessy suddenly laughed in a low voice. She stretched out her hand, jumped back, and threw the cigarette in the trash bin. "Let's go back to sleep," chuckled Bessy. Mary touched her heart and breathed a sigh of relief. "Bessy, you were so impressive," Mary replied. She was referring to what had happened just now. She had really never seen any girl make Layla nervous to that extent. Bessy went to the bedroom, her hands behind her head. She didn't say anything. It took a long time for Mary to hear her 4 words, thin and cold. "I am not a god," she said. A villa somewhere in Chicago. Michael was holding a knife and studying the mannequin. He heard Samuel opening the door in a panic. Michael, there's," shouted Samuel. Michael turned expressionlessly, pointed his thin scalpel at Samuel, and tilted his head. "Can you afford my mannequin if you break it?" asked Michael. Samuel was silent. Michael had spent $5 million customizing human body models, and even the blood vessels had been simulated clearly. He could afford it, but whether or not he could find someone to help customize the human body models was another thing. He paused, then said, "The order was returned." Michael responded. Michael retracted his dagger. A gust of wind raised the corner of his shirts gently. "Why didn't you say so earlier?" asked Samuel. "Samuel!" Michael yelled. Although it was senior year, First Middle School didn't have supplementary classes during the holidays. They had it previously, but after some students' parents reported it to the Education Bureau, they stopped it entirely. In the past 2 days, Bessy was free, except for when she went for her part-time job at the bubble tea shop. Early Saturday morning, Grace called her several times in a row, but she didn't answer. Bessy took her backpack and went directly to the hospital to see Bertha. Bertha lived in the VIP ward of the hospital. She had special care. When Bessy arrived, her aunt was feeding Bertha soup. Susan was sitting on a side chair, playing with her mobile phone. Pete sat on the other side, cutting an apple with a fruit knife. Bessy went in immediately, but stood outside the glass window. She looked at Bertha for a while. Bertha had married her grandfather early, but had her children late. She had her first child in her 30s. She was now close to 80. As people get older, their organs begin to degenerate, and various diseases would then appear. Bessy had ways to help Andrea's legs, but in the face of natural death, illnesses, and various organ failures, even Bessy was helpless. Bessy opened the door and went in. Bertha's spirit improved immediately. "Bessy, I asked your mother to bring these things. Keep them," Andrea said. Bertha's fingers were shaking and unstable as she took out a pile of papers from under her pillow and handed it to Bessy. Bessy looked down. The pile of papers was notes that she had crumpled into the trash before. All written casually. She didn't expect her grandmother to pick it up and keep it well. Seeing that she had no reaction, Bertha couldn't help but pull Bessy's hand and shove the papers into her hand. Bertha was old and had a bad memory, but she still remembered how the Northtown's teacher had looked at those notes, like they were a gem. If it had been another parent, they would definitely have forced their child to learn. However, Bertha was different. She would be happy even if Bessy didn't get married, so all those were just trivial matters. "Cousin, what's this?" asked Susan. When Susan saw Bessy coming, she put her phone back and came over. She only saw the paper. She couldn't see clearly what was written. Bessy rolled up the papers and stuffed it in her school uniform pocket. "Nothing," Bessy replied. She said lightly. Although Susan was curious, she didn't ask much. It just felt strange. They accompanied Bertha at the hospital till noon. Bessy only left for work at the bubble tea shop. On Saturday, Anne still came to school to practice the violin. Anne had a performance on the school anniversary. On weekdays, the driver usually sends her. This time, however, Elise wanted to see Anne off personally, so she followed along. Only Grace could accompany them. The car could enter the campus on Saturday, but when they passed by the door, Anne wanted to drink milk tea. All three got out of the car. The driver came down to queue for Anne to buy milk tea. Anne took Elise's arm, smiled, and introduced her to the current situation in First Middle School. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw a familiar face from the bubble tea shop. Anne was stunned for a moment. Elise noticed that Anne had a strange expression. "What's wrong?" Elise asked. "Mom, why is my sister here?" Anne inquired. Anne glanced at Grace. Grace had already seen her. She was pale and pursed her lips before striding over to the bubble tea shop. Her eyes were frosty. Bessy leaned on the bar side, her head lowered and calmly putting a cup of bubble tea on the table. Grace clenched her fingers tightly. She clutched her $5,000 bag and gritted her teeth. "Bessy, what are you doing? Did I not give you money?" questioned Grace. Behind her, Anne stood at a loss beside Elise. Elise's face looked inexplicable and she asked, "Anne, is this your sister?" "Yeah, I didn't expect my sister to be here." Anne blinked and sighed. Inside the bubble tea shop, Bessy didn't even look up. She took down a new cup and said directly, "Don't disturb me at work." At mention of this, Grace folded her arms tighter. "Work? What are you working for? Have I treated you badly?" Grace's face turned pale, but at the thought that Elise was still outside, she swallowed and suppressed her anger. "I've arranged tuition for you, yet you didn't go. In the end, you're working part-time here? Bessy, who are you showing off to? Have I neglected you? With your grades, even Baybridge High School might not want you. Now that you're in Brightbow High School, why can't you just study properly? Tidy up your things and come with me. You're going back to class," Grace said, and when Bessy ignored her, she turned to another employee and said indiscriminately, "Where is your boss? Tell him to come over here." Her tone was arrogant and high. The other employee had never seen this happen before. She looked at Grace's name-brand clothes and then at Bessy, who wore her school jacket every day. She was a little awkward but felt like Grace wasn't easy to provoke. "Bessy, just go back with your mother," the employee tried to persuade her. "It's your mother after all. She must be doing it for your good." "How can there be hatred between mother and daughter? My son can't even attend Brightbow High School, yet you're attending there but still so ungrateful for what you have?" Someone felt sour. Children these days have bad grades and don't even attend class. Then they come to work instead. You're so young and yet such a troublemaker. It must be hard on your mother. Several onlookers nodded their heads in agreement one by one. In their traditional view, parents could have no fault. Those surrounding her in agreement gave Grace courage. She reached out to grab Bessy by the arm. Her hand just reached out and snapped. A bony joint with a sharp hand knocked her down. Grace looked up immediately and saw a clean and handsome face. The teenager was calm and his movements weren't rude. He said calmly, "If you wanted to have control of her now, shouldn't you have done it 10 years ago?" Grace's mind went blank for a moment. Brian didn't plan to just let it go. He bit his cigarette, turned around and pointed at Grace. "This woman got divorced when her daughter was just 7 years old, and then she married a wealthy man. She refused to bring her daughter back to live with her. In 12 years, she never came back to visit even once. Do you all still think she is a mother?" "But if I didn't care about her, why would I help her study at Brightbow High School?"
Speaking of this, I want to ask more.
Brian looked at Grace and suddenly smiled, but his eyes were cold.
I remember that Principal White already let Bessy attend Brightbow High School 1 year ago. I want to ask you, why do you have to make it seem like Bessy could only attend school because of your family?
His question was followed by silence. For a while, Grace didn't know what to say. She was pale, her mind was empty, and she acted mechanically. Brian chuckled.
Speaking of that, Bessy is already grown, and you've never even taken care of her before. Forget that you took advantage of her. Now you're still calling her out and criticizing her?
At this moment, the onlookers no longer looked at Bessy. Instead, they were all staring at Grace. Having a stepfather meant having a stepmother. What biological mother wouldn't go to see her daughter for 12 years? Grace didn't expect things to turn against her like this. In these 12 years, she had never experienced such a dilemma. Everyone was staring and pointing at her while gossiping, making her feel uncomfortable. Soon, someone recognized the $5,000 bag in her hand, and then they started discussing Bessy's clothes. Grace saw someone hold up their mobile phone to take a picture, and she lowered her head as she quickly walked out of the tea shop. Bessy's expression remained unchanged from beginning to end. Another employee recognized Brian and towered her head in horror, afraid to say a word. Her hands holding on to money were shaking. Waiting outside was Elise. She smirked. Grace clutched her handbag and didn't look at Elise. "How did my sister know him?" Anne whispered. "Why?" Elise only tilted her head slightly and let Anne take her arm. Anne looked in Brian's direction in a complicated way. Brian was well known and hardly anyone dared to mess with him, but they all discussed his appearance in private. That's the famous school bully of Baybridge High School next door. They don't do honorable business, and I heard that he's even related to the black market. Anne whispered. Grace's expression worsened. Elise glanced at Grace, smiled slightly and nodded her head. She raised her eyebrows and spoke thoughtfully. "Anne, that person said that Bessy managed to attend Brightbow High School, not because of your father?" Episode 24. Principal White's Successor. Anne also looked in Brian's direction and said, "Back then, Brightbow High School didn't accept Bessy. We all know how her grades are not the highest, but I heard that Principal White went to Fairfield to help the underprivileged out before, and 3 years ago, an incident happened there. I guess Principal White took pity on her." As soon as Elise heard this, she thought for a moment but didn't ask any more. Bessy didn't look like someone who was associated with Brightbow High School's principal. They went to see Anne's performance. Anne's charisma was really good, and though she was young, she played the violin well. Elise also knew music and naturally understood it. She would return to Evanston in a few days. She thought about it and pulled Anne aside after her performance. "What do you want, Elise?" she said in surprise. Elise pondered for a moment and said, "I've found a violin teacher for you, an international master. I can't tell you his name for the time being, but he has a well-known apprenticeship. It's best that you take some original music to him. A few months from now, you will have a chance to perform in front of him. Do you understand?" Anne didn't respond. Her heart was beating like a drum. What was Elise's background? The family she married into was somewhat famous in Evanston. How amazing would the violin teacher be, even if she was full of high praises? Anne was well aware of her own background. This kind of teacher was sure to be demanding. She could write her own music, but it might not be what he wanted. "Anne?" Anne didn't speak for a while, and Elise called her again. Anne was a little absent-minded. She remembered the music she'd written that she kept locked in a drawer. After a while, she looked up, her eyes glowing like a torch, and said certainly with her fists clenched, "Elise, thank you. I won't let you down." The bubble tea shop wasn't far away. Michael bit a cigarette in his mouth. He didn't light it, and his face was expressionless. His eyes were droopy and frosty. "Samuel, you better have something urgent." Samuel looked at Michael with an expression of resentment. How anxious could he be? The beauty had already been saved by the hero. If you were in a TV show, you would be the second male lead. The idiot who only knew how to give. The one that couldn't survive past 3 episodes. He wanted to vomit, but there was something stranger now. Samuel turned and repeated what had happened to Michael. Then he tutted. "Michael, it's been so many years and so many people have fallen into Principal White's hands. But when have you seen Principal White being so compassionate to give a letter of recommendation?
He said last time that he found a successor. Do you remember?
Michael did not speak. He looked towards the tea shop, eyes clear and slightly narrowed. It wasn't clear what he was thinking. Samuel repeated himself, thinking that he wasn't listening. Only then did Michael turn towards him, brows furrowed.
Who's he?
Samuel was speechless. He'd missed the point. Michael hung his head lower with the cigarette in his mouth.
The huge murder case 3 years back. Principal White was around.
Samuel was stunned and confused.
What have you found? Speculation.
Michael puffed a ball of smoke as his eyes darkened.
Principal White isn't that sympathetic. Something's been off since he arrived in Fairfield.
So, regarding the successor, Samuel looked up all of a sudden. Michael smiled.
2 possibilities. 1, it's a smokescreen. Given Principal White's status and background, even if he does have a successor in mind, it's not likely that he'd pass it on to an outsider at the expense of the White family's interests. 2, there actually is a successor that he's willing to give up huge interests for. He made the move to look for us and even mentioned it. He's probably asking for my help. If this is the case, Evanston might undergo reshuffling, and by this, the successor might not even make it out of there. It is indeed much easier to keep someone alive in the Clark family than in the White family.
Samuel hadn't thought of this point. He'd never been good at deducing such complex issues. He smiled.
Then something's wrong with this. Bessy should be that lucky survivor. Principal White couldn't possibly have his eyes on someone like her, right?
Michael did not respond. There was still a key point he couldn't figure out. What role did Bessy play in all of this exactly? It was very odd that someone, like Principal White, would personally give a student a recommendation letter. He puffed some more smoke and looked towards the bubble tea shop.
If he really has his eye on someone as a successor, then things are going to change drastically.
Considering Principal White's status, Samuel only just realized how important this matter was. He looked up, as if wanting to say something more, but saw that Michael had already entered the store. It was the weekend and the store wasn't crowded. Bessy had Brian waiting by the side. She placed a cup of bubble tea on the table and smelt a familiar, refreshing scent with hints of lemon and brown sugar. She looked up and saw Michael, with one hand on the bar counter. He was tall and often had to look down at people. Even with his default expression, his gaze carried an air of oppression. He looked at the long list of menu items and furrowed his brows. It was evident that he hadn't visited such stores before.
Give me a cup of something nice.
He took his card out to swipe for payment. Bessy looked at it and guessed that Michael had probably never lived like a normal human being. Everyone either paid with cash or by digital payment. Who would use a limited edition card for such a small amount? She pressed his hand down. It's on me. Michael did not respond to that. He simply looked down at his hand and her fair, slender fingers. She had a beautiful hand, except that her fingers were not cared for very much. Her fingertips were cool, but somehow they felt warm against his skin. He looked up politely and saw that Bessy had her eyes on the cups and toppings to prepare his drink. She looked so focused, with one hand holding the cup and the other busy with getting the toppings. She stirred the bubble tea with a spoon, but without touching the edges of the cup. The cup was clear and had a logo printed on it. The bubble tea filled about 2/3 of the cup, and then was carefully topped with freshly sliced lemon. Bessy was always serious and conscientious when she did something she deemed important. She usually appeared cold and unapproachable, but whenever she was engrossed in an activity, the armor that she usually donned instantly fell apart. Even her lashes were pointing downwards at a perfect angle.
Thank you,
he said as he received his cup of tea. As he walked to the side, he subconsciously tightened his grip on the cup. The Grant household.
Scarlett, you should eat more. How's school? Are you getting used to staying on campus yet?
Gerald Grant scooped a lot of food into Scarlett's bowl. Thank you, Gerald, Scarlett quietly said. My classes are all really nice.
Jacob is home too. In that case, don't return to school this weekend. Stay here and have Lily whip up more treats for you.
Gerald smiled. He was usually quiet and shrewd, a man of few words. It seemed like he had given all his kindness and patience to this girl here. Lily Grant tossed her silverware on the table. I'm done eating. She then stormed upstairs in her heels. Jacob furrowed his brows at his mother. Scarlett tightened her grip on her fork and smiled at Gerald. Gerald, I'll be taking my exam soon. I should get back to school to do my homework.
Lily is just like that.
Gerald looked at Scarlett and sighed.
Scarlett, you...
I'm done eating too. I'll go get my clothes. Scarlett interrupted him. She had finished the food that Gerald had scooped up for her and headed upstairs too. Her room was nicely decorated. As she opened the wardrobe, she saw that there weren't many clothes inside. The clothes were mostly from when she was younger. Gerald was a man, after all. He didn't quite know how to take care of her in all aspects. However, he'd transfer money into her account every month, though she wouldn't touch a cent of it. But she did not mind. She took the clothes that were there and went downstairs. From a corner, she could hear Jacob talking to Gerald. Jacob had put his silverware down too and was wiping his mouth with a napkin.
Dad, it's not just Mom who wants to know. I want to know too. Who exactly is Scarlett? Why did you just bring her home all of a sudden and treat her so well? Is she your bastard child from somewhere? Or the daughter, or your first love? Why are you just like your mom?
Gerald hurled his fork. He looked at Jacob sternly and said,
Jacob, don't you ever speak like this before Scarlett. She better not be your daughter, but I want to know, even if her parents are both deceased, she should have relatives who take care of her. Why are you taking this upon yourself?
Jacob lit a cigarette. In the corner, Scarlett kept her head down. She went downstairs to say goodbye to Gerald. Lily had never liked her, but she'd never abused her either. Moreover, Gerald was treating her like she was his own.
Be careful on your way.
Gerald had cooled down immediately and spoke to her nicely. Jacob watched as Scarlett left.
That's exactly it. You're way too nice to Scarlett. This isn't how you usually are. If you want Mom to treat Scarlett better, then you'd better explain things to her.
The weekend passed very quickly. Monday's last period in school was a class meeting in their homeroom class. Stephen spoke confidently about life lessons before taking a sip of coffee.
Is anyone volunteering to write up the minutes for today's meeting?
Nobody raised their hands. In the homeroom, nobody really wanted to take on extra responsibilities. Stephen casually appointed someone.
Mary, you write pretty well. You'll be in charge this time.
Bessy was half leaning against a wall, still recovering from her illness. Her classmate quietly agreed. She felt that Mary was simply too nice. After they were done with the miscellaneous discussions, there was only 10 minutes of class time left. Stephen encouraged them to work on their homework. Bessy unwrapped a lollipop and put it in her mouth. She sucked on it as she read her textbook. Out of nowhere, the loud clicking of high heels could be heard arriving at the front door of the classroom. Then a shrill voice of a woman.
Stephen, why do you have Bessy in your class? What do you think she's doing at Brightbow High School? Creating trouble? If she affects my class's studies, will she be able to compensate for disrupting their future?
Episode 25. Embarrassing Yourself. People were always prejudiced by first impressions, and so was Catherine prejudiced by the first impression of Bessy. Catherine Lewis's last recollection of Bessy was when Principal White had given her that personal file. At that point, her impression of Bessy was ruined. When she heard reports of Bessy's fight with Layla, she angrily rushed to the homeroom class.
Mr. Scott, I've already told you a long time ago that we can't keep this student. Is school a place where she can do as she pleases? Do you see other students acting like her?
The whole class turned to look at her. Bessy calmly flipped through a textbook. She leaned slightly against the wall, slightly lowering her eyes. It seemed that she did not care at all.
Miss Lewis, this could possibly be a misunderstanding. Bessy is not an unreasonable student. We should clarify matters first.
Stephen frowned slightly, walked to the door, and adjusted his glasses.
Misunderstanding? What sort of misunderstanding can there be? Mr. Scott, I'm just about done with you. You may not want your class to learn well, but I want my class to do well during the exams. I will speak to Principal White regarding this matter, but you must also inform Bessy's parents to come for a meeting.
Catherine said as she looked over at Bessy. Catherine contemptuously remarked,
Mr. Scott, you don't have to say anything. Save it for when you speak to the principal.
Turning around, she walked off in her high heels. Gradually, some students started whispering in a low voice. What's going on? Bessy fought with Layla? She doesn't seem to like anyone who would fight with others. Someone whispered. What do you mean? Who do you think would look like someone who would get into a fight then? That's true. Haven't you heard? In the past when Bessy did something illegal, even the police were shocked.
Really? What did she do?
What had initially been a quiet classroom was now a classroom full of commotion due to this matter.
Didn't Layla tell you why we fought?
Bessy put down the book, stood up, and looked at Catherine with eyes blazing with anger. Catherine did not expect her to speak and was slightly startled. She sneered.
A fight is a fight. What is there to explain?
You are right. There is nothing to explain, Miss Lewis. Do you care about your students? Bessy glanced at Stephen and did not give him a chance to speak first.
Of course I care about my students. They all want to excel in their exams and get into good universities.
Catherine was slightly offended.
Your excuses are all useless, Bessy. Today I have no choice but to—
A cell phone suddenly appeared in Bessy's hand, and she threw it on the table.
Who are you going to talk to? Principal White? You don't have to look for him, because he will be here soon.
In reality, Catherine was not really serious about looking for the principal. Principal White was usually busy and many things in the school were managed by the vice principal. Looking for Principal White was not easy. Many unknown visitors usually came to see Principal White. These impressive visitors drove luxury cars and were very impressive. He had to cater to them, of course. In recent years, the teachers and students of the school came to understand that Principal White's background was probably not simple. It was as difficult to reach him as calling the hotline of the White House. The classroom fell silent. The students looked at Bessy in surprise. Catherine was also stunned for a moment before saying with an angry expression,
"Do you think that I will believe a lie that you just casually threw out? I could also say that Principal White is at my house now."
"What's with the ruckus?"
Before Catherine could finish, a deep voice was heard. An older man slowly walked over with his hands behind his back. He hid his sharp eyes behind his glasses. Principal White rarely appeared, so most of the students did not recognize him. However, his esteemed presence was not to be underestimated.
"Principal White!"
Catherine and Stephen's hearts skipped a beat. Kenneth could not help but look at Bessy. So, this was the life-saving benefactor who was able to get his grandfather to call him here? Who exactly was Bessy? The classroom was silent again. Catherine paused and looked at Bessy. Gritting her teeth, she said,
"Principal White, it is wonderful that you are here. This transfer student just joined the school not long ago and is already stirring up trouble. Last night, she fought with Layla, a student in my class, and disrupted the learning of my students. I am sure you know that our class has to focus on the upcoming exams and cannot afford to be disrupted."
Principal White was still calmly looking at Bessy. Bessy lowered her eyes and seemed to be thinking about something, not making a sound. Her expression was indecipherable. Catherine looked at her more scornfully. Now that Principal White was here, why was she still silent? After Principal White had first arrived, the class was quiet for a moment, but now a commotion had broken out again. The voices of many girls chattering were heard.
"I bet her act was exposed and she has nothing to say anymore. Out of everyone, she just had to fight with Layla and now Principal White is really here."
Layla's grades were not bad and her father was very rich. The books in the school's library were all donated by her father.
What act? She was the one who invited him here.
She has the same last name as Anne, so why is she so different from her?
Most of the gossip came from the girls. Once Bessy had begun attending the school, she had become a celebrity. Every day after class, many people would look for her. If she were like Anne, who had a good family background, good results, and good looks, they would be accepting. But someone like Bessy just made them jealous. The classroom was filled with noise.
"Miss Lewis, you said that you cared about the students in your class. So why don't you know that Layla from your class has been threatening Scarlett with violence?"
Bessy lifted her head, smiled, and said quietly,
"You!"
Catherine was shocked.
"There's no need to argue. You can take a look at the surveillance cameras that monitor the hallway of the girls' dormitory."
Bessy turned to look at Catherine and coldly said,
"You said that you care so much about the health and growth of your students, so I want to know why you do not care that Layla has been insulting and threatening Scarlett."
Her last sentence made the entire class stare at the teacher. Catherine's face gradually turned pale. Since it concerned Scarlett, Principal White became serious. He sternly said,
"Miss Lewis, I have to check the surveillance cameras and get the police to investigate this. If it really is as bad as Bessy said, violence in school cannot be tolerated."
How did this turn into school violence and involve the police? Since Bessy had mentioned the surveillance cameras, it meant that she had not lied. Catherine tried to adapt to the circumstances and quickly said,
"Principal White, I apologize. I did not clarify things and did not know that this was related to Scarlett."
"It's no use telling me this. Bessy is the one you should address."
Principal White calmly reminded her. Catherine was pale with rage. Apologizing to a student, especially a student she looked down on, was a little humiliating. In the end, she braced herself and apologized to Bessy in front of the entire class.
"Bessy, I'm sorry for misunderstanding you."
"That's not needed. Besides, I've heard that in the past that you were a good and fair teacher who did care about her students. I didn't expect that you would be so corrupt and despise the poor and try to find favor with the rich," Bessy indifferently said. A few boys in the room could not help but burst into laughter. Catherine did not want to stay a moment longer. She lowered her pale face and left. Today, she had embarrassed herself. When she walked past Stephen, she directed her anger at him and viciously said, "Mr. Scott, don't be so proud. Look at the trash in your class. I want to see how many of them will actually pass the college entrance examination." The bell that marked the end of class sounded. Due to this conflict, the class was delayed for about 8 minutes. Many students were already gathered outside the classroom. Paul stood up and kicked a chair. Standing firmly, he arrogantly said,
Bessy, what exactly happened? Do you need me to help you teach Layla a lesson?
The students in the room who were gossiping about Bessy did not dare to say anything more. Bessy stuffed her books into her backpack and said indifferently, "No." After glancing at Bessy, Kenneth took his books and said faintly,
"Let's go. Anne said that you will be practicing a new song tonight."
Recently, he had been obsessed with Anne's new song, and Paul also knew about it. Anne had not seen Kenneth and Paul downstairs, so she went upstairs to wait for them. Finding that a lot of students had gathered outside the classroom and were talking about Bessy without noticing that she was there, Anne could not help but be worried. She pursed her lips, looked up and sighed. "I hear that my sister has gotten into trouble again." Kenneth was as iconic as ever. He rarely spoke much. He paused for a while before looking at Anne, quiet and taciturn. However, Paul suddenly tilted his head and looked at Anne strangely. Anne squeezed her textbook tightly and smiled. "Did I say something wrong? Getting into fights is nothing new for my sister. That is the gospel truth. If she were not a troublemaker, a school would not have rejected her in the past. If Principal White had not taken pity on her, how could she have been accepted here considering her personal record?"
"Why are you so prejudiced against your sister? She's not like what you said. Today's problems were caused by Layla from your class."
Paul dribbled the basketball in his hand and rebutted her without much expression. Anne was startled. She did not think that Paul would speak to her like that.
"I'm going to the gym to play basketball. I won't be going to the art building today,"
Paul said to Kenneth before dribbling his basketball away and rallying a few boys to follow him. He did not apologize to Anne. Kenneth nodded. After Paul left, he saw that Anne was still in shock and slowly spoke.
"Principal White is not a sympathetic person."
Anne did not react. After a while, she pursed her lips and smiled. "You're joking again. How do you know what sort of person Principal White is like?" After that, she hugged her books and quietly walked away. Looking at the few boys in front, who were heading off to play basketball, Anne felt very depressed. Anne was not very sure of Kenneth's identity. There was that one time when he'd defended her in front of Brian, and she'd felt that someone who could stand up to Brian was not ordinary. However, in the past 2 years, Kenneth stayed in the dormitory and dressed and ate simply. Due to this reason, even though his surname was White, no one associated him with Principal White. In contrast, Paul was an obvious rich second-generation heir. The two of them walked into the art building. Anne did not do anything else besides practicing diligently on the violin. She seemed to spend almost 10 hours every day on her violin. Now, her playing was smoother and clearer than in the past. However, it still seemed to lack something.